Hello, everybody. We are live. Welcome to another stream. It is going to be a reading stream today. We are going to be reading The Hobbit. Let me just get a few things ready here. Get that pinned. Okay. Alright, we're just going to get the word out here that we're live. So we should be finishing up The Hobbit today. I don't think that there's any reason that we wouldn't. I think it's going to be not a problem. Let's see. We're starting at chapter 12? I believe it's chapter 12, Inside Information. So this right here is the bit we have left to go. It does seem like a lot, but it also seems like it's about a fourth of what we have done, you know, of the entirety of it, I should say. And this is the fourth stream. If we have to go a little bit extra late to finish it, we could do that, but I think it'll be pretty easy. And of course, following this, subsequent to The Hobbit, we will continue to do monthly reading streams with The Lord of the Rings. Hello, Moogle. How are you doing today? So, you know, for those of you that enjoy the Hobbit, you know, we'll be doing The Lord of the Rings next, starting with, of course, The Fellowship of the Ring. It's really 3 volumes, but it's really one volume. But yes, we should be getting through the rest of the book today. No problem. I have extra water here for my voice, because doing reading streams is a lot, and I do mean a lot more taxing on my voice than doing a gaming stream. Because when you're doing a gaming stream, you're not speaking as often, as constantly, I should say. But you know how it is. My glasses are not dirty. My vision's just blurry right now. Like, nope, that wasn't the glasses. That was my eye. Oh, yes. And of course, I'm sure that I've made everybody quite aware, but tomorrow's stream will be a shorter affair than normal. We will be doing it only about 2 hours instead of 4, due to the fact that I'm taking my mom to the dentist. But likely they're not going to do much. She's going to get an X-ray, and they'll give her an examination and then come up with a treatment plan. Now, why do I see something from chat that's coming through on the screen, but it's not in my chat widget? I can't even read that. It's so small, though. Oh, there it is. Wow, I think the chat thing is a little broken. Paula, your message came through on the screen before I saw it. Oh, that is kind of perfect, don't you think? Is your character a halfling? Oh yeah, there's a bit of a lag on the stream chat. It's showing up on screen before I'm able to see it. Like I can see that Moogle said hi to Polly, but it has yet to show up where I could actually see it better. That's not ideal. Oh, there we go. And I see Moogle with the watch streak. Thank you. Wow, 85. That's a high watch streak. Okay, it seems to be catching up now. I think that was just on Twitch's end. That was on Twitch's end. We're going to be starting momentarily here. Oh, it's still laggy. But yeah, is your character a halfling by any chance? That would be interesting. The halflings in Dungeons and Dragons are essentially hobbits. They just couldn't call them that because it's copyrighted and trademarked and such. They did the same thing in Ultima. In the Ultima games in the 80s. In the earlier ones, you would choose your race, and there were humans and elves and dwarves. And then there were two other ones. One were called Fuzzies, which I guess were sort of like Ewoks. And then there was another one called Hobbits, which is pretty self-explanatory. But in some of the console ports and such, they changed it to Bobbit. So, they could have changed it to Halfling. Nobody has a trademark on Halfling, but yeah, that's a problem. The chat is not behaving properly. I wonder if there's a way that I could refresh it, because there's like 3 or 4 messages that haven't come through on my end yet. Okay, there we go. That seemed to help it. Oh, hello there, Monkismo. How are you doing? You were a dungeon master? I've never actually... I've never actually played Dungeons and Dragons. It sounds like you fell victim to what they called the Satanic Panic in the 80s, where it was sort of sensationalized journalism where everything was seen as satanic, and a lot of parents sort of got caught up in this frenzy of trying to banish these things from their homes. Dungeons and Dragons perhaps being one of the biggest ones that was targeted in this fashion. Yeah, the chat is... oh, half-elf, I see. Yeah, the chat is very laggy today. I don't know why. It's not quite behaving properly. I don't know why it's doing that. Hopefully I got it fixed. Hey, Alice. It looks like I might have fixed it by switching to viewer list and then switching back to chat. But yeah. Monkismo, how did you find me? Did you come from YouTube, or is this a random happenstance? I see that you're new here. My name is John C.R. I also go by NecroVMX. I do stream every day. And at least twice a month related to Tolkien. We're going to be finishing The Hobbit today. That's the plan. That is the plan. I did put that alert out on YouTube that says that I'm live there. Yeah, I YouTube. Okay, thank you. Well, thank you for coming by. It's great to have you. I don't know if you've seen the previous Hobbit reading streams or the VODs, as they call them, video on demand, that I've put up on the YouTube channel. But the way that this works is we just read a bit, then we talk about it. I would like to just do readings, but it is a copyright concern, and I do have a lot to say about the work, so we sort of came up with a compromise that I'd read for a bit and then talk about it, and it can be transformative and educational in that sense, and I don't get into any kind of trouble for reading books on Twitch or YouTube. I will eventually switch the streams over. Well, not switch the streams over to YouTube, but multi-stream to YouTube. But we have to reach 10,000 subscribers first. That's where I'll feel financially secure enough to pay for the multi-streaming. Because right now, it's something that I would only use once or twice a month. So I'm feeling like that's not all that worth the price. But if the YouTube channel is continuing to make money, we'll get there. Well, we're going to go ahead and get started because I don't want to go too late today. Yes, a cost-benefit analysis moment. Exactly that. I don't want to go too late, and we want to finish the book today. So let me get to where we left off, which is, we read chapter 11. The beginning of chapter 12. We're going to kill the music. Once I find where it's coming from. Here we are. The Rankin-Bass Hobbit is an interesting anomaly because we're going to come over here now. At the time that it came, it's got good music too. At the time that it came out, which I wasn't quite born yet, I was born in 1980, but I saw it when I was young. And at the time that it came out, and in the ensuing years, people were pretty dissatisfied with it. It wasn't really received all that well, and it's been so vindicated, and people look back on it with such fondness now. Easily, in my opinion, the best adaptation of The Hobbit. Is it perfect? No. There's room for improvement, but it was pretty good. Okay, so to catch everybody up, we're starting with chapter 12, which is Inside Information. So, of course, our titular Hobbit, Bilbo Baggins, has gone on this adventure with Thorin Oakenshield and a bunch of other dwarves, and they are to get to Erebor, the Lonely Mountain, in Rhovanion, which is quite far away from the Shire, and somehow dispose of the dragon Smaug and reclaim the treasures of Erebor, as well as Thorin Oakenshield's title as King Under the Mountain. And they have gone through many, many trials. Gandalf is not currently with them. And they have gotten to the mountain, and they have just managed to open the secret door using the map and the key. Of course, that came from Thrain, Thorin's father, who had been captured by Sauron the Necromancer. And I wouldn't say rescued, but he was discovered by Gandalf. He died shortly after the conversation, but he gave him the map and the key and told them to bring them to his son. And he eventually found out who Thrain was, because the dwarf did not give his name when they met. Some of this information is not actually in The Hobbit. Anyway, Lord Elrond found the moon runes on the map, which gave Bilbo the instructions on how to open the door, and that's where we're at, starting with chapter 12, Inside Information. It does. Rankin-Bass captured the spirit of the story, absolutely. I actually have a video, before I start here, I actually have a video that I've uploaded but not published yet. I've been procrastinating a bit on this, of me reacting to the first bit of the Rankin-Bass Hobbit and analyzing it and everything. And I had to go through a bit of a copyright battle with Warner Brothers, which I did win. They did release the claim, but I haven't managed to put the video. I have to make a thumbnail and everything, and I haven't managed to do that yet. And I have to record the next part, too. But here we go. Chapter 12, Inside Information. For a long time the dwarves stood in the dark before the door and debated, until at last Thorin spoke. Now is the time for our esteemed Mr. Baggins, who has proven himself a good companion on our long road, and a hobbit full of courage and resource far exceeding his size, and, if I may say so, possessed of good luck far exceeding the usual allowance. Now is the time for him to perform the service for which he was included in our company. Now is the time for him to earn his reward. Hi, Grumpy Boy. You are familiar with Thorin's style on important occasions, so I will not give you any more of it, though he went on a good deal longer than this. It certainly was an important occasion, but Bilbo felt impatient. By now he was quite familiar with Thorin too, and he knew what he was driving at. If you mean to think it is my job to go into the secret passage first, O Thorin Thrain's son Oakenshield, may your beard grow ever longer, he said crossly. Say so at once and have done. I might refuse. I have got you out of 2 messes already, which were hardly in the original bargain, so that I am, I think, already owed some reward, but 3rd time pays for all, as my father used to say. And somehow I don't think I shall refuse. Perhaps I have begun to trust my luck more than I used to in the old days. He meant last spring, before he left his own house, but it seemed centuries ago. But anyway, I think I will go and have a peep at once and get it over. Now who is coming with me? He did not expect a chorus of volunteers, so he was not disappointed. Fili and Kili looked uncomfortable and stood on one leg, but the others made no pretense of offering, except old Balin, the lookout man, who was rather fond of the Hobbit. He said he would come inside at least, and perhaps a bit of the way too, ready to call for help if necessary. The most that can be said for the dwarves is this: they intended to pay Bilbo really handsomely for his services. They had brought him to do a nasty job for them, and they did not mind the poor little fellow doing it if he would. But they would all have done their best to get him out of trouble, if he got into it, as they did in the case of the trolls at the beginning of their adventures, before they had any particular reasons for being grateful to him. There it is, dwarves are not heroes, but calculating folk with a great idea of the value of money. Some are tricky and treacherous and petty bad lots, some are not, but are decent enough people, like Thorin and company, if you don't expect too much. So, to pause here, Bilbo mentions his father, which is interesting. You don't really hear too much about Bilbo's extended family in The Hobbit. A lot of the Hobbit genealogy and such came out in The Lord of the Rings, and of course, Bilbo's father was a fellow by the name of Bungo Baggins, and his wife was Belladonna Took. And it's interesting that they built Bag End, and the reason that, if you notice that the way that they refer to things in the Shire, the river is just called the Water. The hill that Bilbo lives under is just called the Hill. And the street there used to just be called the Row. And what happened is when they built Bag End, they had to excavate so much dirt out of the mountain, out of the hill, really, and they shot it out into the Row, and so that's how it became known as Bagshot Row. Just a little bit of lore about Bilbo's parents. The other thing I want to mention here is the assessment of dwarves, which is not so much coming from Tolkien, because it does sort of... It goes against what he said about dwarves in other places. This is coming from Bilbo, because Bilbo had mixed experiences with dwarves, but it does sort of play into the idea of the dwarves as being very focused on money, and we're getting a little bit of what's to come, because we're coming towards the end of the adventure, and it's not going to be this heroic thing where somebody kills the dragon, well, somebody does kill the dragon, but somebody in Bilbo's party kills the dragon, and then they all share the treasure, and they all go home, and everybody's happy. Obviously, The Hobbit has a good ending, but I would not say it has a happy ending. It has a rather violent ending, and a lot of it has to do with the dragon sickness, the avarice in gold, which we could say was imparted into the world by Melkor. Melkor is essentially Satan, and he created the concept of evil, and he put himself into the world. His essence, his power, his malevolence is in the world itself. Absolutely a subversion of the typical fairy story, Alice. Absolutely true. And it was said in, I forget which book, I want to say The Peoples of Middle-earth, that this malevolent energy that Melkor put into the world is most concentrated in gold. And we're going to hear a lot in the coming chapters about dragon sickness, the intense greed to hoard money with no intention of spending it or using it for anything. And of course, a dragon sleeps on a pile of gold. Dragons collect treasure. They collect gold and silver and gems. They don't use it for anything. They have no use of it. They just want to have it, and they don't want others to have it. And that is the nature of evil, is malevolence without any sort of pretense at doing the right thing, and that's why, when the discussion comes up of who is more conspicuous consumption, conspicuous consumption usually involves spending, though. It involves flaunting wealth through extravagant spending, while this is more of hoarding wealth. The discussion comes up of who is more evil, Sauron or Melkor. Melkor, of course, also known as it is in a way a form of gluttony. Yes, I would say that it's closer to gluttony than to avarice. Avarice and gluttony, a marriage of the two sins, I would say. Who is more evil, Morgoth or Sauron? And it's of course Morgoth. He created the concept of evil. Melkor. But he knew he was the villain. He was evil for evil's sake. It's just malevolence. It's petty. It's just bad. There's no other way to describe him but just bad. Whereas Sauron is sort of the guy who thinks he's trying to do the right thing, but he's going about it in completely the wrong manner. He's trying to bring order, and he's not considering the rights of the free peoples or anything about free will. He's become corrupted, whereas Morgoth is the corrupter. And we see this with this unfettered greed of Smaug, and you'll see it in Thorin. And this is a bit of I think that Bilbo is, because Bilbo's not just writing his autobiography here, he's writing a travelogue, he's writing a story to tell to his nieces and his nephews and his younger cousins back in the Shire. He's setting it up so that it doesn't seem like Thorin becomes bad out of nowhere, that he just loses his mind. And it's sort of setting up, well, dwarves are very concerned with money and such. So I just wanted to talk about that before we continue. The stars were coming out behind him in a pale sky barred with black when the hobbit crept through the enchanted door and stole into the mountain. It was far easier going than he expected. This was no goblin entrance or rough wood elf's cave. It was a passage made by dwarves at the height of their wealth and skill, straight as a ruler, smooth-floored and smooth-sided, going with a gentle, never-varying slope direct to some distant end in the blackness below. After a while, Balin bade Bilbo good luck and stopped where he could still see the faint outline of the door, and by a trick of the echoes of the tunnel hear the rustle of the whispering voices of the others just outside. Then the hobbit slipped on his ring, and warned by the echoes to take more than the hobbit's care to make no sound, he crept noiselessly down into the dark. He was trembling with fear, but his little face was set and grim. Already he was a very different hobbit from the one that had run out without a pocket handkerchief from Bag End long ago. He had not had a pocket handkerchief for ages. He loosened his dagger in its sheath, tightened his belt, and went on. "Now you're in for it at last, Bilbo Baggins," he said to himself. "You went and put your foot right in that night at the party, and now you have got to pull it out and pay for it. Dear me, what a fool I was and am," said the least tookish part of him. "I have absolutely no use for dragon-guarded treasures, and the whole lot could stay here forever. If only I could wake up and find this beastly tunnel with my own front hall at home." He did not wake up, of course, but went still on and on, till all sign of the door behind him had faded away. He was altogether alone. Soon he thought it was beginning to feel warm. "Is that some kind of glow I seem to see coming right ahead down there?" he thought. It was. As he went forward it grew and grew, till there was no doubt about it. It was a red light, steadily getting redder and redder. Also, it was now undoubtedly hot in the tunnel. Wisps of vapor floated up past him, and he began to sweat. A sound, too, began to throb in his ears, a sort of bubbling, like the noise of a large pot galloping on the fire, mixed with a rumble as of a gigantic tomcat purring. This grew to the unmistakable gurgling noise of some vast animal snoring in its sleep down there in the red glow in front of him. It was at this point that Bilbo stopped. Going on from there was the bravest thing he ever did. The tremendous things that happened afterwards were as nothing compared to it. He fought the real battle in the tunnel alone, before he ever saw the vast danger that lay in wake. At any rate, after a short halt, on he did, and you can picture him coming to the end of the tunnel, an opening of much the same size and shape as the door above, though it peeps the hobbit's little head. Before him lies the great bottommost cellar or dungeon hall of the ancient dwarves, right at the mountain's root. It is almost dark, so that its vastness can only be dimly guessed, but rising from the near side of the rocky floor there is a great glow, the glow of Smaug. There he lay, a vast red golden dragon, fast asleep. A thrumming came from his jaws and nostrils and wisps of smoke, but his fires were low in slumber. Beneath him, under all his limbs and his huge coiled tail, and about him on all sides, stretching away across the unseen floors, lay countless piles of precious things, gold wrought and unwrought, gems and jewels, and silver red stained in the ruddy light. Smaug lay with wings folded like an immeasurable bat, turned partly on one side so that the hobbit could see his underparts and his long pale belly crusted with gems and fragments of gold from his long lying on his costly bed. Behind him, where the walls were nearest, could dimly be seen coats of mail, helms and axes, swords and spears hanging, and there in rows stood great jars and vessels filled with a wealth that could not be guessed. To say that Bilbo's breath was taken away is no description at all. There are no words left to describe his staggerment, since men changed the landscape that they learned of elves in the days when the world was wonderful. Bilbo had heard tell and sing of dragon hoards before, but the splendor, the lust, the glory of such treasure had never yet come home to him. His heart was filled and pierced with enchantment and with the desire of dwarves, and he gazed motionless, almost forgetting the frightful guardian at the gold beyond price and count. He gazed for what seemed an age before drawn almost against his will. He stole from the shadow of the doorway across the floor to the nearest edge of the mounds of treasure. Above him the dragon sleeping lay, a dire menace even in his sleep. He grasped a great two-handled cup, as heavy as he could carry, and cast one fearful eye upward. Smaug stirred a wing, opened a claw, the rumble of his snoring changed its note. Then Bilbo fled. But the dragon did not wake, not yet, but shifted into other dreams of greed and violence, lying there in his stolen hall while the little hobbit toiled back up the long tunnel. His heart was beating, and a more fevered shaking was in his legs than when he was going down, but still he clutched the cup. And his chief thought was, "I've done it. This will show them. More like a grocer than a burglar indeed. Well, we'll hear no more of that." Nor did he. Balin was overjoyed to see the hobbit again, and as delighted as he was surprised. He picked Bilbo up and carried him out into the open air. It was midnight, and clouds had covered the stars, but Bilbo lay with his eyes shut, gasping and taking pleasure in the feel of fresh air again, and hardly noticing the excitement of the dwarves, or how they praised him and patted him on the back, and put themselves and all their families for generations to come at his service. So to pause here, what's interesting is that when faced with this treasure, that he finally sees it in front of him, and he sees the dragon in front of him, Bilbo actually himself gets a little tiniest bit of the dragon sickness. It passes quickly, though. But he almost focuses more on the treasure than the dragon. We get this very brief description of Smaug. He's big. He's red golden. His wings are folded like a bat, and he's laying on his side. And that his underbelly is encrusted with silver and gold and gems and jewels, which comes into play later is actually a very important plot line. But the description is more of the treasures. The jars, the arms, the armor, the coins, the baubles, everything that's there. And he almost forgets himself. Now, of course, he comes to his senses, but this just goes to show that nobody in this world is completely immune to this sort of avarice. We don't get somebody who, maybe Gandalf, we would say. Maybe Gandalf would be the one that would be, but Gandalf's not human. He's not a person like you or I, or even like Bilbo, or like Thorin, or like Elrond. He's an angel, so he's a bit above it all. And then we see, of course, that within that particular order of angels, they're not perfect. Like Saruman is quite greedy, and collects things that really aren't his, such as the Elendilmere, and trying to get the One Ring, just to have it, really, just to lord it over Gandalf. But it's interesting that you see this, that even Bilbo is sort of floored, when not just a moment ago he was wondering why he came, and that he has no use for treasure. And we'll see it with the Arkenstone as well. You know, they mentioned the Arkenstone once previously. We're gonna hear a bit more about it soon. We're going to continue along here. The dwarves were still passing the cup from hand to hand and talking delightedly of the recovery of their treasure, when suddenly a vast rumbling woke in the mountain underneath, as if it was an old volcano that had made up its mind to start eruptions once again. The door behind them was pulled nearly to and blocked from closing with a stone, but up the long tunnel came the dreadful echoes from far down in the depths of the bellowing and a tramping that made the ground beneath him tremble. Then the dwarves forgot their joy and their confident boasts of a moment before, and cowered down in fright. Smaug was still to be reckoned with. It does not do to leave a live dragon out of your calculations if you live near him. Dragons may not have much real use for all their wealth, but they know it to an ounce as a rule, especially after long possession, and Smaug was no exception. He had passed from an uneasy dream, in which a warrior, another altogether insignificant in size, but provided with bitter sword and great courage, figured most unpleasantly, to a doze, and from a doze to wide waking. There was a breath of strange air in his cave. Could there be a draught from that little hole? He had never felt quite happy about it, though it was so small, and now he glared at it in suspicion, and wondered why he had never blocked it up. Of late, he had half fancied that he caught the dim echoes of a knocking sound from far above that came down through it to his lair. He stirred and stretched forth his neck to sniff. Then he missed the cup. Thieves! Fire! Murder! Such a thing had not happened since first he came to the mountain. His rage passes description, the sort of rage that is only seen when rich folk that have more than they can enjoy suddenly lose something that they have long had but never had before used or wanted. His fire belched forth. The hall smoked. He shook the mountain roots. He thrust his head in vain at the little hole, and then coiling his length together, roaring like thunder underground, he sped from his deep lair through its great door out into the huge passages of the mountain palace and up towards the front gate. Not to pause here. Yes, very biblical. You do see, I don't want to say allegory because it's not true. You don't see biblical allegories in Tolkien's work, but you see applications. The way that Christopher Tolkien described it, when asked about allegory, J.R.R. Tolkien would usually say, oh, people say it's an allegory for this or an allegory for that. It's not. And Christopher had a little bit more patience, and he said that, while his father disliked allegory and he disliked apologetics, just like any other author, you could find his thoughts on certain subjects within his work. That doesn't make it an allegory. It just means that you hear the voice of the author and you get his opinions on things. And he certainly holds opinions as a Catholic man that align with the Bible, and he has some that disagree with it, of course, as well, because he was a very outspoken man. And what's interesting here is he really, really does not like hoarded wealth. He's representing the idea of avarice and the idea of hoarded wealth as a dragon. And what's interesting here is he makes a very good metaphor here of the rage that Smaug is feeling is of a rich person who has more money than they know what to do with, suddenly missing something that they didn't even remember that they had. The eye of the needle quote. Yes. And I have seen some people try to really twist the eye of the needle. I believe it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of the needle than for rich men to enter the kingdom of God. And people have tried to twist that into whatever they want to twist it into. But Tolkien, I think he felt that it was very correct and that he agreed with it as it is said. And, yeah, they claim it's a physical landmark. That's exactly what I've seen. Which, I mean, whether it is or isn't does not take away from the message that is being said, is that it is difficult for a rich man because here we see somebody, and Smaug is not a man, he's a dragon. These are creatures that Melkor created very long time ago through necromancy. And they're born of evil. They can only really do evil. And Smaug is what Tolkien would refer to as petty evil. That's not to say that he is small. He is large. He is dangerous. He is deadly. He is a menace. But he is petty evil. Evil with a lowercase e. He has no grand designs. He has no grand ambitions. He does not wish to take over the world. He does not wish to enslave others. He does not wish to impede others' free will. He is petty evil. He does things that are bad. He hurts people. He eats people. He does it because that's what suits him. It's sort of the difference that we'll see in The Lord of the Rings between Sauron and Saruman. Saruman is petty evil. Sauron is great evil. Capital G, capital E. It's not a degree of danger. It's not a degree of deeds. It's a difference of... It's a philosophical difference is what it is. Smaug is greedy. Smaug is proud. Smaug is petty. And Smaug is cunning. And that's really all Smaug is. He's a creature of evil. Just like all dragons in Tolkien stories are, because they were created by Melkor a long, long time ago out of necromancy, which is itself a terrible, terrible magic because it involves the manipulation of souls. Okay, to continue along here. Oh. To hunt the whole mountain, till he had caught the thief, and had torn and trampled him, was his one thought. He issued from the gate, the waters rose in fierce whistling steam, and up he soared, blazing into the air, and settled on the mountain top in a spout of green and scarlet flame. The dwarves heard the awful rumor of his flight, and they crouched against the walls of the grassy terrace, clinging under boulders, hoping somehow to escape the frightful eyes of the hunting dragon. There they would have all been killed if it had not been for Bilbo once again. "Quick, quick," he gasped. "The door, the tunnel, it's no good here." Roused by those words, they were just about to creep inside the tunnel when Bifur gave a cry. "My cousins, Bombur and Bofur, we have forgotten them. They are down in the valley." "They will be slain, and all our ponies too, and our stores lost," moaned the others. "We can do nothing." "Nonsense," said Thorin, recovering his dignity. "We cannot leave them. Get inside, Mr. Baggins and Balin, and you too, Filly and Killy. The dragon shan't have all of us. Now, you others, where are the ropes? Be quick." Those were perhaps the worst moments they had been through yet. The horrible sounds of Smaug's anger were echoing in the stony hollows far above. At any moment he might come blazing down, or fly whirling round and find them there, up near the perilous cliff's edge, hauling madly on the ropes. Up came Bofur, and still all was safe. Up came Bombur, puffing and blowing while the ropes creaked, and still all was safe. Up came some tools and bundles of stores, and then danger was upon them. Oh, thank you, Polly. Thank you. A whirring noise was heard. A red light touched the points of standing rocks. The dragon came. They had barely time to fly back to the tunnel, pulling and dragging in their bundles, when Smaug came hurtling from the north, licking the mountain sides with flame, beating his great wings with a noise like a roaring wind. His hot breath shriveled the grass before the door, and drove in through the crack they had left, and scorched them as they lay hid. Flickering fires leaped up, and black rock shadows danced. Then darkness fell as he passed again. The ponies screamed with terror, burst their ropes, and galloped wildly off. The dragon swooped and turned to pursue them, and was gone. "That'll be the end of our poor beasts," said Thorin. "Nothing can escape Smaug once he sees it. Here we are, and here we shall have to stay, unless anyone fancies tramping the long open miles back to the river with Smaug on the watch." It was not a pleasant thought. They crept further down into the tunnel, and there they lay and shivered through it, warm and stuffy, until dawn came pale through the crack of the door. Every now and again through the night they could hear the roar of the flying dragon grow and then pass and fade, as he hunted round and round the mountain sides. He guessed from the ponies and from the traces of the camps he had discovered that men had come up from the river and the lake, and had scaled the mountainside from the valley where the ponies had been standing. But the door withstood his searching eye, and the little high-walled bay he had kept out his fiercest flames. Long he had hunted in vain, till the dawn chilled his wrath, and he went back to his golden couch to sleep, and to gather new strength. He would not forget or forgive the theft. Not if 1,000 years turned him into smoldering stone. But he could afford to wait. Slow and silent he crept back to his lair, and half closed his eyes. Hello there, what is it, Spartan? How are you doing? Welcome to the stream. When morning came, the terrors of the dwarves grew less. They realized that dangers of this kind were inevitable in dealing with such a guardian, and that it was no good giving up their quest yet. Nor could they get away just now, as Thorin had pointed out. Their ponies were lost or killed, and they would have to wait some time before Smaug relaxed his watch sufficiently for them to dare the long way on foot. Luckily they had saved enough of their stores to last them still for some time. They debated long on what was to be done, but they could think of no way of getting rid of Smaug, which had always been a weak point in their plans, as Bilbo felt inclined to point out. Then, as is the nature of folk that are thoroughly perplexed, they began to grumble at the Hobbit, blaming him for what had first so pleased them, for bringing away a cup and stirring up Smaug's wrath so soon. "What else do you suppose a burglar is to do?" asked Bilbo angrily. "I was not engaged to kill dragons, that is a warrior's work, but to steal treasure. I made the best beginning I could. Did you expect me to trot back with the whole horde of Thror upon my back? If there was any grumbling to be done, I think I might have a say. You ought to have brought 500 burglars, not one. I am sure it reflects great credit on your grandfather, but you cannot pretend that you ever made the vast extent of his wealth clear to me. I should want hundreds of years to bring it all up, if I was 50 times as big, and Smaug as tame as a rabbit." After that, of course, the dwarves begged his pardon. "What then do you propose we should do, Mr. Baggins?" asked Thorin politely. "I have no idea at the moment. If you mean about removing the treasure, that obviously depends entirely on some new turn of luck, and getting rid of Smaug. Getting rid of dragons is not at all easy in my line, but I will do my best to think about it. Personally, I have no hopes at all, and wish I was safe back at home. Never mind that for the moment. What are we to do now, today?" "Well, if you really want my advice, I should say we can do nothing but stay where we are. By day we could no doubt creep out safely enough to take the air. Perhaps before long 1 or 2 could be chosen to go back to the store by the river and replenish our supplies. But in the meantime everyone ought to be well inside the tunnel by night. Now I will make you an offer. I've got my ring, and I will creep down this very noon. Then, if ever Smaug ought to be napping, and see what he's up to. Perhaps something will turn up. Every worm has his weak spot, as my father used to say, though I am sure it was not from personal experience." So to pause here, you might wonder why would Bilbo's father say that? Every worm has his weak spot, and in this case, worm is referring to an Old English word, sometimes spelled just the same as you would spell the word worm, sometimes with a Y instead of an O. Vowels were sort of a suggestion in Old English, and it means dragon actually, and you'll see that Bilbo and others refer to Smaug as a worm several times, and they're not doing it to be insulting. They're not saying that he's this lowly creature that burrows through dirt and is small and disgusting and slimy. This is just what dragons were called in Old English. They were called worms, and that's, for example, wyvern is derived from worm and such. So it is a coincidence that we have a word, worm, that means either as a verb to burrow through the ground, or as a noun referring to a lowly creature, lowly, slimy creature that you would as soon use as fishing bait than anything else. That would be wyvern. Worm, whether it's spelled with a Y or an O, is a generalized term for a dragon. Alice, that emote didn't work. Wyvern is a dragon that has 2 legs instead of 4. And then you can find long worm and great worm and some other different variations of it. Wyvern is, of course, the two-legged version. So that's the variant there. It's actually wyvern, but worm, just like that. Oh, goose with a knife. Yeah. All right, let's continue on here. Where is another one. Weyr. I just thought of that one. Okay. Oh, I've lost my spot. Where am I here? Here we are. Naturally, the dwarves accepted the offer eagerly. Already they had come to respect little Bilbo. Now he had become the real leader in their adventure. He had begun to have ideas and plans of his own. When midday came, he got ready for another journey down into the mountain. He did not like it, of course, but it was not so bad now. He knew more or less what was in front of him. Had he known more about dragons and their wily ways, he might have been more frightened and less hopeful of catching this one napping. The sun was shining when he started, but it was as dark as night in the tunnel. The light from the door, almost closed, soon faded as he went down. So silent was he going that smoke and a gentle wind could hardly have surpassed it, and he was inclined to feel a bit proud of himself as he drew near the lower door. There was only the very faintest glow to be seen. Old Smaug is weary and asleep, he thought. He can't see me and he won't hear me. Cheer up, Bilbo. He had forgotten or had never heard about dragons' sense of smell. It is also an awkward fact that they can keep half an eye open, watching while they sleep, and they are suspicious. Smaug certainly looked fast asleep, almost dead and dark, with scarcely a snore more than a whiff of unseen steam, when Bilbo peeped once more from the entrance. He was just about to step out onto the floor when he caught a sudden thin and piercing ray of red from under the drooping lid of Smaug's left eye. He was only pretending to sleep. He was watching the tunnel entrance. Hurriedly Bilbo stepped back and blessed the luck of his ring. Then Smaug spoke. "Well, thief, I smell you and I feel your air. I hear your breath. Come along. Help yourself again. There is plenty and to spare." But Bilbo was not quite so unlearned in dragon lore as all that, and if Smaug hoped to get him to come near us so easily, he was disappointed. "No, thank you, O Smaug the Tremendous," he replied. "I did not come for presents. I only wished to have a look at you, and to see if you were truly as great as the tales say." I did not believe them. "Do you now?" said the dragon, somewhat flattered, even though he did not believe a word of it. "Truly, songs and tales fall utterly short of the reality, O Smaug the chiefest and greatest of calamities," replied Bilbo. "You have nice manners for a thief and a liar," said the dragon. "You seem familiar with my name, but I don't seem to remember smelling you before. Who are you, and where do you come from, may I ask?" "You may indeed. I come from under the hill, and under the hills and over the hills my paths led, and through the air. I am he that walks unseen." "So I can well believe," said Smaug. "But that is hardly your usual name." "I am the clue finder, the web cutter, the stinging fly. I was chosen for the lucky number." "Lovely titles," sneered the dragon, "but lucky numbers don't always come off." "I am he that buries his friends alive and drowns them and draws them alive again from the water. I come from the end of the bag, but no bag went over me." "Those don't sound so creditable," scoffed Smaug. "I am the friend of bears and the guest of eagles. I am ring winner and luck wearer, and I am barrel rider," went on Bilbo, beginning to be pleased with his riddling. "That's better," said Smaug. "But don't let your imagination run away with you." Okay. To pause here, it's interesting. He knows he's caught. He can't be seen, but he can be smelled. And he certainly doesn't want to piss Smaug off. Even though he can't be seen, Smaug can certainly just start shooting fire everywhere, and that would be the end of Bilbo. So he starts flattering him. He calls him the chiefest and greatest of calamities, and Smaug the Tremendous, and all this stuff. But what's interesting is, obviously, Bilbo made a big mistake when he was under the Misty Mountains, and he told Gollum his name. And that's gonna bite everybody in the butt in the next book. But here he's more cautious. He doesn't tell Smaug his name. And every single thing that he says is a reference to things that have come before us. So let's see. He said he came from under the hill. He does live under a hill. Under the hills and over the hills his path led. That's pretty self-explanatory. Through the air, he did fly with eagles, although he was not on the back of an eagle. Well, for the second part, he was on the back of an eagle. For the first part, he was hanging from a dwarf who was hanging on an eagle's talons. Walks unseen, obviously, as the One Ring. You can't see him. The clue finder. He was the one that found the door. The web cutter. Of course, the forest, cutting the webs of the spiders. The stinging fly, referring to his sword's sting. Chosen for the lucky number. Why did Thorin... I mean, we know why Gandalf wanted Bilbo in the party. Why did Thorin want a burglar? Thorin wanted a burglar. Gandalf wanted specifically Bilbo. And it's true that Gandalf wanted Bilbo for his own reasons, and that he was the one that convinced Thorin that he needed a burglar. But a big thing was that there were 13 of them. Now, 13 is considered an unlucky number, and there's a whole reason behind that having to do with the Last Supper and whatnot. Can I get a moderator to take care of that in the chat, please? So, when Thorin met Bilbo and was sort of not very impressed with him in the Shire, thank you, Alice. He was not really impressed with him, and Gandalf made a comment about, then you can go as 13 and have all the bad luck you want. Does Gandalf believe that 13 is a bad number? Probably not. He's a lot smarter than that. He's not a superstitious sort, but he knows that Thorin does, and that's what's important here. So Bilbo was indeed chosen to be the lucky number. Although what's interesting is that if you notice that there is the theme that whenever Gandalf leaves the party, then they are 13 again, and then they start having bad lucks. Came from the end of a bag, of course, referring to his home. Bag and, but no bag went over me. Ring winner, of course, even though he already had the ring. This is a leftover from the first edition. He didn't win the ring. In the original first edition of The Hobbit, he did win the ring. He had found it already, but Gollum planned to give it to him. And when he couldn't find Bilbo's prize, he was actually quite upset in the first edition, and he said that he couldn't find it. And Bilbo very shrewdly did not mention that he already had it. Instead asked, in lieu of the ring, to be shown the way out of the mountain. And then Gollum happily led him out of the mountain. That is what the text of the first edition of The Hobbit reflected, and that's also the story that Bilbo told to people until much, much later when he admitted the truth. But so calling himself Ring Winner is sort of an orphaned reference to this first edition. Luck Wearer, that's pretty self-explanatory, and Barrel Rider as well. He did ride that barrel, and then he put his friends, he buried them alive and drowned them, and then pulled them out alive. That refers to the barrels as well. Okay. This, of course, is the way to talk to dragons if you don't want to reveal your proper name, which is wise, and don't want to infuriate them by a flat refusal, which is also very wise. No dragon can resist the fascination of riddling talk and of wasting time trying to understand it. There was a lot here which Smaug did not understand at all, though I expect you do, since you know all about Bilbo's adventures to which he was referring, but he thought he understood enough, and he chuckled in his wicked inside. I thought so last night, he smiled to himself. Lake men, some nasty scheme of those miserable tub-trading lake men are on a lizard. I haven't been down that way for an age and an age, but I will soon after that. Very well, O Barrel Rider, he said aloud. Maybe a barrel was your pony's name, maybe not, though it was fat enough. You may walk unseen, but you did not walk all the way. Let me tell you, I ate 6 ponies last night, and I shall catch and eat all the others before long. In return for the excellent meal, I will give you one piece of advice for your good. Don't have more to do with dwarves than you can keep. Dwarves, said Bilbo in pretend surprise. Don't talk to me, said Smaug. I know the smell and taste of dwarf, no one better. Don't tell me that I can eat a dwarf-ridden pony and not know it. You'll come to a bad end if you go with such friends, thief, barrel rider. I don't mind if you go back and tell them so from me. But he did not tell Bilbo that there was one smell he could not make out at all, Hobbit smell. It was quite outside his experience and puzzled him mightily. I suppose you got a fair price for that cup last night, he went on. Come now, did you? Nothing at all. Well, that's just like them. And I suppose they're skulking outside, and your job is to do all the dangerous work and get what you can when I'm not looking for them.
and you'll get a fair share. Don't you believe it. If you get off alive, you'll be lucky."
Bilbo was now beginning to feel really uncomfortable. Whenever Smaug's roving eye, seeking for him in the shadows, flashed across him, he trembled, and an unaccountable desire seized hold of him to rush out and reveal himself and tell all the truth to Smaug. In fact, he was in grievous danger of coming under the dragon spell, but plucking up courage, he spoke again. "You don't know everything, O Smaug the Mighty," said he. "Not gold alone brought us hither."
"Ha ha! You admit the us?" laughed Smaug. "Why not say us 14 and be done with it, Mr. Lucky Number? I am pleased to hear that you had other business in these parts besides my gold. In that case, you may, perhaps, not altogether waste your time. I don't know if it has occurred to you that, even if you could steal the gold bit by bit, a matter of 100 years or so, you could not get very far. Not much use on the mountainside, not much use in the forest, bless me. Had you ever thought of the catch? A 14th share, I suppose, or something like it with the terms, eh? What about delivery? What about cartage? What about armed guards and tolls?"
And Smaug laughed aloud. He had a wicked and wily heart, and he knew his guesses were not far out, though he suspected that the lake men were at the back of the plans, and that most of the plunder was meant to stop there in the town by the shore that in his young days had been called Esgaroth. You will hardly believe it, but poor Bilbo was really very taken aback. So far all his thoughts and energies had been concentrated on getting to the mountain and finding the entrance. He had never bothered to wonder how the treasure was to be removed, certainly never how any part of it that might fall into his share was to be brought all the way back to Bag End under Hill. Now a nasty suspicion began to grow in his mind. Had the dwarves forgotten this important point too? Or were they laughing in their sleeves at him all the time? That is the effect that dragon talk has on the unexperienced. Bilbo, of course, sought to have been on his guard, but Smaug had rather an overwhelming personality.
"I tell you," he said, in an effort to remain...
This is Bilbo. "I tell you," he said, in an effort to remain loyal to his friends and to keep his end up. "That gold was only an afterthought with us. We came over hill and under hill, by wave and by wind, for revenge. Surely, O Smaug, the unaccessibly wealthy, you must realize that your success has made you some bitter enemies." Then Smaug really did laugh, a devastating sound which shook Bilbo to the floor, while far up in the tunnel the dwarves huddled together and imagined that the hobbit had come to a sudden and very nasty end. "Revenge!" he snorted, and the light of his eyes lit the hall from floor to ceiling like a scarlet lightning. "Revenge! The king out of the mountain is dead. And where are his kin that dare seek revenge? Girion, Lord of Dale, is dead, and I've eaten his people like a wolf among sheep. And where are his sons that dare approach me? I kill where I wish, and none dare retreat. I laid low the warriors of old, and their like is not in the world today. Then I was but young and tender, now I am old and strong, thief in the shadows," he gloated. "My armor is like tenfold shields. My teeth are swords, my claws spears, a shock of my tail a thunderbolt, my wings a hurricane, and my breath death." "I have always understood," said Bilbo in a frightened squeak, "that dragons were softer underneath, especially in the region of the chest, but doubtless so one fortified has thought of that." The dragon stopped short in his boasting.
"Your information is antiquated," he snapped. "I am armored above and below with iron scales and hard gems. No blade can pierce me."
"I might have guessed it," said Bilbo. "Truly there can be nowhere can be found the equal of Lord Smaug the Impenetrable. What magnificence to possess a waistcoat of fine diamonds."
"Yes, it is rare and wonderful indeed," said Smaug, absurdly pleased.
He did not know that the hobbit had already caught a glimpse of his peculiar undercovering in the previous visit, and was itching for a closer view for reasons of his own. The dragon rolled over.
"Look," he said. "What do you say to that?"
"Dazzlingly marvelous, perfect, flawless, staggering," exclaimed Bilbo aloud, but what he thought inside was, "Old fool. Why, there is a large patch in the hollow of his left breast, as bare as a snail out of its shell." After he had seen that, Mr. Baggins's one idea was to get away. "Well, I really must not detain your magnificence any longer," he said, "or keep you from much-needed rest. Ponies take some catching, I believe, after a long start, and so do burglars," he added as a parting shot, as he darted back and fled up the tunnel. It was an unfortunate remark, for the dragon spouted terrific flames after him, and fast though he sped up the slope. He had not gone nearly far enough to be comfortable before the ghastly head of Smaug was thrust against the opening behind. Luckily the whole head and jaws could not squeeze in, but the nostrils sent forth fire and vapor to pursue him, and he was nearly overcome, and stumbling blindly on in great pain and fear. He had been feeling rather pleased with the cleverness of his conversation with Smaug, but his mistake at the end shook him down into better sense. "Never laugh at live dragons, Bilbo, you fool," he said to himself. And it became a favorite saying of his later, and passed into a proverb. "You aren't nearly through this adventure yet," he added. And that was pretty true as well. The afternoon was turning into evening when he came out again and stumbled and fell in a faint on the doorstep. The dwarves revived him and doctored his scorches as well as they could, but it was a long time before the hair on the back of his head and his heels grew properly again. It had all been singed and frizzled right down to the skin. In the meanwhile, his friends did their best to cheer him up, and they were eager for his story, especially wanting to know why the dragon had made such an awful noise and how Bilbo had escaped. But the hobbit was worried and uncomfortable, and they had difficulty in getting anything out of him. On thinking things over, he was now regretting some of the things he had said to the dragon, and was not eager to repeat them. The old thrush was sitting on a rock nearby, with his head cocked on one side, listening to all that was said. It shows what an ill temper Bilbo was in. He picked up a stone and threw it at the thrush, which merely fluttered aside and came back. "Drat the bird," said Bilbo crossly. "I believe he is listening, and I don't like the look of him." "Leave him alone," said Thorin. "The thrushes are good and friendly. This is a very old bird indeed, and is maybe the last left of an ancient breed that used to live about here, tamed to the hands of my father and grandfather. They are a long-lived and magical race, and this might even be one of those that were alive then, a couple of 100 years or more ago. The men of Dale used to have a trick of understanding their language and used them for messengers to fly to the men of the lake and elsewhere." "Well, he'll have news to take to Lake Town all right, if that's what he's after," said Bilbo. "Though I don't suppose there are any people there left that trouble with thrush language." "Why, what has happened?" cried the dwarves. "Do get on with your tale." So Bilbo told them all he could remember, and he confessed that he had a nasty feeling that the dragon guessed too much from his riddles added to the camps and the ponies. "I am sure he knows we came from Lake Town and had help from there, and I have a horrible feeling that his next move may be in that direction. I wish to goodness I had never said that about Barrel Rider. He would make even a blind rabbit in these parts think of lakemen." Well, it cannot be helped, and it's difficult not to slip in talking to a dragon, or so I have always heard," said Balin, anxious to comfort him. "I think you did very well, if you ask me. You found out one very useful thing at any rate, and got home alive. And that is more than most can say who have had words with the likes of Smaug. It may be a mercy and a blessing yet to know that the bare patch in the old worm's diamond waistcoat." That turned the conversation, and they all began discussing dragon slayings, historical, dubious, and mythical, and the various sorts of stabs and jabs and undercuts and different arts, devices, and stratagems by which they had been accomplished. The general opinion was that catching a dragon napping was not as easy as it sounded, and the attempt to stick one or prod one in his sleep was likely to end in disaster than a bold frontal attack. All the while they talked, the thrush listened, till at last, when the stars began to peep forth, it silently spread its wings and flew away. And all the way they talked on, the shadows lengthened, and Bilbo became more and more unhappy, and his foreboding grew. At last he interrupted them. "I am sure we're very unsafe here," he said, "and I don't see the point of sitting here. The dragon has withered all the pleasant green, and anyway the night has come to it, and it is cold. But I feel it in my bones that this place will be attacked again. Smaug knows that I have come down to his hall, and you can trust him to guess where the other end of the tunnel is. He will break all this side of the mountain to bits if necessary to stop up our entrance, and if we are smashed with it the better he will still like it." "You are very gloomy, Mr. Baggins," said Thorin. "Why has not Smaug blocked the lower end, then, if he is so eager to keep us out?" "He has not, or we should have heard him." I don't know. Because at first he wanted to try and lure me in again, I suppose, and now perhaps because he is waiting till after tonight's hunt, or because he does not want to damage his bedroom if he can help it. But I wish you would not argue. Smaug will be coming out any minute now, and our only hope is to get well into the tunnel and shut the door." He seemed so much in earnest that the dwarves at last did as he said, though they delayed shutting the door. It seemed like a desperate plan, for no one knew whether or how they could get it open again from the inside. And the thought of being shut in a place which the only way out led through the dragon's lair was not one they liked. Also, everything seemed quite quiet, both outside and down the tunnel, so for a longish while they sat inside not far down from the half-open door and went on talking. The talk turned to the dragon's wicked words about the dwarves. Bilbo wished he had never heard them, or at least that he could feel quite certain that the dwarves were now absolutely honest when they declared that they had never thought at all about what would happen after the treasure had been won. We knew it would be a desperate venture, said Thorin, and we knew that still. And I still think that when we have won, it will be time enough to think about what to do about it. As for your share, Mr. Baggins, I assure you we are more than grateful, and you shall choose your own 14th as soon as we have anything to divide. I am sorry if you're worried about transport, and I admit the difficulties are great. The lands have not become less wild with the passing of time, rather the reverse. But we will do whatever we can for you and take our share of the cost when the time comes. Believe me or not as you like. From that, the talk turned to the great hoard itself and to the things that Thorin and Balin remembered. They wondered if they were still lying there unharmed in the hall below, the spears that were made for the armies of the great King Bladothin, long since dead. Each had a thrice-forged head, and their shafts were inlaid with cunning gold. But they were never delivered or paid for. Shields made for warriors long dead, for great golden cup of Thor, two-handed, hammered, and carven with birds and flowers, whose eyes and petals were jewels, coats of mail gilded and silvered and impenetrable, the necklace of Girion, Lord of Dale, made of 500 emeralds green as grass, which he gave for the arming of Zelda's son, and a coat of dwarf-linked rings, the like of which had never been made before, for it was wrought of pure silver to the power and strength of triple steel. But fairest of all was the great white gem, which the dwarves had found beneath the roots of the mountain, the heart of the mountain, the Arkenstone of Thrain. The Arkenstone, murmured Thorin in the dark, half dreaming with his chin upon his knees. It was like a globe with 1,000 facets. It shone like silver in the firelight, like water in the sun, like snow under the stars, like rain upon the moon. But the enchanted desire of the horde had fallen from Bilbo. All through their talk, he was only half listening to them. He sat nearest to the door with one ear cocked for any beginnings of sound without. His other was alert for echoes beyond the murmurs of the dwarves, for any whisper of a movement far below. Darkness grew deeper, and he grew even more uneasy. "Shut the door," he begged them. "I fear that dragon in my marrow. I like the silence far less than the uproar of last night. Shut the door before it is too late." Something in his voice gave the dwarves an uncomfortable feeling. Slowly Thorin shook off his dreams, and getting up he kicked away the stone that wedged the door. Then they thrust upon it, and closed with a snap and a clang. No trace of a keyhole was there left on the inside. They were shut in the mountain. And not a moment too soon. They had hardly gone any distance down the tunnel when a blow smote the side of the mountain like a crash of battering rams made of forest oaks and swung by giants. The rock boomed, the walls cracked, and stones fell from the roof on their heads. What would have happened if the door had still been open, I don't like to think. They fled further down the tunnel, glad to still be alive. While behind them outside they heard the roar and rumble of Smaug's fury. He was breaking the rocks to pieces, smashing wall and cliff with the lashings of his huge tail. To their little lofty camping ground, the scorched grass, the thrush's stone, the snail-covered walls, the narrow ledge, and all disappeared in a jumble of smithereens, and an avalanche of splintered stones fell over the cliff into the valley below. Smaug had left his lair in silent stealth, quietly soared into the air, and then floated heavy and slow in the dark like a monstrous crow, down the wind toward the west of the mountain in hopes of catching unawares something or somebody there, and of spying the outlet to the passage which the thief had used. This was the outburst of his wrath when he could find nobody and see nothing, even where he guessed the outlet must actually be. After he had let off his rage in this way, he felt better, and he thought in his heart that he would not be troubled again from that direction. In the meanwhile, he had further vengeance to take.
"Barrel rider," he snorted. "Your feet came from the water side, and up the water you came without a doubt. I don't know your smell, but if you're not one of those men of the lake, you had their help. They shall see me, and remember who is the real king under the mountain."
He rose in fire and went away south toward the running river.
Okay.
Pause here because that's the end of that chapter. The biggest comment that I want to make here is the Arkenstone. I mistakenly earlier said that he had mentioned the Arkenstone once. This is actually the first mention of the Arkenstone. And it's interesting, when The Hobbit was first adapted into a very, very short animated feature in the 1960s, which was an ashcan, it was never released, Although I have a reaction to it on my YouTube channel. It was discovered in, I think, around 2006 and put out onto the internet. They made the Arkenstone very important. They made it a great heart-shaped jewel. And Bilbo actually killed the dragon in that version of The Hobbit, which is a mess. It's very funny, though. By fitting the Arkenstone onto a great bow and shooting it into the dragon. Now, the biggest thing here that comes up, and I will read and respond to that in just a moment, is the origin of the Arkenstone. I'm going to read you this very specifically. The fairest of all was the great white gem, which the dwarves had found beneath the roots of the mountain, the heart of the mountain, the Arkenstone of Thrain. One of the biggest questions that crops up many, many times about the Arkenstone is it a Silmaril? It is not a Silmaril. So, the Silmarils were made from an unknown substance, what we would call an undiscovered element called Selima. And the only person that discovered it and could work with it was Feanor himself. And that's why they needed Feanor to break open the Silmarils to revive the two trees, because only he could do it. Now, Morgoth took the Silmarils away. What happened to them? One is in the sky. Earendil has it. You could look up and see it. Another went into the sea, along with Maglor, and another went into the pits of the earth, along with Maeglin. Now, a lot of people say, well, the one that Maeglin had, and he jumped into a fiery chasm, could that have been the Arkenstone? Of course not. So Silmar, referring to Selim, and then Ril, referring to brilliance. They were holy, and they shone with a great light, the mingled light of the two trees of Valinor. And to give you an idea of how brilliant that was, the sun itself is but a fruit of the golden tree. The moon is but a flower of the silver tree. So imagine these trees with all these different flowers and all these different fruits, all as brilliant as the sun and the moon themselves. And that light captured in this unknown crystal, and then hallowed by Varda, the queen of the angels, so that anything evil that touches it would be scorched. Smaug wouldn't want something like that near him. It's too holy. Morgoth was burned by it, but Morgoth was clever. He put it on a crown, and he wore them. He put all three of them on a crown and wore them until Beren took one away from him. But anyway, there's a lot of reasons why, even if we discount the holiness and the type of light that comes out of it, because Thorin describes how the Arkenstone glows. Under the moon, under the sun, under the stars. It reflects light, it amplifies light. It doesn't have a glow of its own, and it glows differently depending on where it is and what kind of light is hitting it. And in some of the supplementary material that we have in like the history of Middle-earth and the history of The Hobbit, we learn that the dwarves found what would become the Arkenstone and cut it. They wouldn't have been able to cut it if it was a Silmaril. So, no, it's not a Silmaril. The location is entirely wrong, because that happened in Beleriand or near Beleriand. It's way too far to the west to be near the Lonely Mountain. Now, it's interesting. You say that when you were a kid, the conversation between Bilbo and Smaug was like one of your favorite parts. Me too. I read this first when I was about 7 years old, and there were two parts that stuck with me. One is Bilbo talking to Smaug, and the other is Bilbo talking to the spiders when he taunts them in the forest. That last month we did that part. That still sticks with me quite a bit. All right, so we're going to move on here to Chapter 13, Not at Home. In the meanwhile, the dwarves sat in darkness, and utter silence fell about them. Little they ate, and little they spoke. They could not count the passing of time, and they scarcely dared to move, for the whisper of their voices echoed and rustled in the tunnel. Attercop, yes. If they dozed, they woke still to the darkness and to silence going on unbroken. At last, after days and days of waiting, as it seemed, when they were becoming choked and dazed for want of air, they could bear it no longer. They would almost have welcomed sounds from below of the dragon's return. In the silence they feared some cunning devilry of his, but they could not sit there forever. Thorin spoke. "Let us try the door," he said. "I must feel the wind on my face soon or die. I think I would rather be smashed by Smaug in the open than suffocate in here." So several of the dwarves got up and groped back to where the door had been, but they found that the upper end of the tunnel had been shattered and blocked with broken rock. Neither key nor magic it had once obeyed would ever open that door again. "We are trapped," they groaned. "This is the end. We shall die here." But somehow, just when the dwarves were most despairing, Bilbo felt a strange lightening of the heart, as if a heavy weight had gone from under his waistcoat. "Come, come," he said. "While there's life, there's still hope, as my father used to say. And third time pays for all. I'm going down the tunnel once again. I have been that way twice, and when I knew there was a dragon at the other end, and I will risk a third visit when I am no longer sure. Anyway, the only way out is down, and I think this time you'd all better come with me." In desperation they agreed, and Thorin was the first to go forward by Bilbo's side. "Now do be careful," whispered the hobbit, "and as quiet as you can be. There may be no Smaug at the bottom, but then again there may be. Don't let us take any unnecessary risks." Down, down they went. The dwarves could not, of course, compare with the hobbit in real stealth, and they made a deal of puffing and shuffling with echoes magnified alarmingly. But though every now and again Bilbo, in fear, stopped and listened, not a sound stirred below. Near the bottom, as well as he could judge, Bilbo slipped on his ring and went ahead. But he did not need it. The darkness was complete, and they were all invisible, ring or no ring. In fact, so black was it that the hobbit came to this opening unexpectedly, put his hand on air, stumbled forward, and rolled headlong into the hall. There he lay, face downwards on the floor, and did not dare to get up or hardly even to breathe. But nothing moved. There was not a gleam of light, unless, as it seemed to him, when at last he slowly raised his head, there was a pale white glint above him and far off in the gloom. But certainly it was not the spark of dragon fire, though the worm stench was heavy in the place, and the taste of vapor was on his tongue. At length Mr. Baggins could bear it no longer. "Confound you, Smaug, you worm," he squeaked aloud. "Stop playing hide-and-seek. Give me a light, and then eat me if you can catch me." Faint echoes ran round the unseen hall, but there was no answer. Bilbo got up and found that he did not know in what direction to turn. "Now I wonder what on earth Smaug is playing at," he said. "He is not at home today, or tonight, or whatever it is, I do believe. If Oin and Gloin had not lost their tinder boxes, perhaps we can make a little light and have a little look around before the luck turns." "Light!" he cried. "Can anybody make a light?" Let me catch up on the chat here. Yeah, Tolkien's accent, it was good. His voice was very interesting to hear. There's not that many audio recordings of him out there, but it is interesting to hear them. The dwarves, of course, were very alarmed when Tolkien fell forward into the step with a bump into the hall, and they sat huddled just where he had left them at the end of the tunnel. "Shh!" they hissed when they heard his voice. And though that helped the hobbit to find where they were, it was some time before he could get anything else out of them. But in the end, when Bilbo actually began to stamp on the floor and screamed out "Light!" at the top of his shrill voice, Thorin gave way, and Oin and Gloin went back to their bundles at the top of the tunnel. After a while, the twinkling gleam showed them returning. Oin with a small pine torch alight in his hand, and Gloin with a bundle of others about his arm. Quickly Bilbo trotted to the door and took the torch, but he could not persuade the dwarves to light the others or come to join him yet. As Thorin carefully explained, Mr. Baggins was still officially their expert burglar and investigator. If he liked to risk a light, that was his affair. They would wait in the tunnel for his report. So he sat near the door and watched. They saw the little dark shape of the hobbit start across the floor, holding his tiny light aloft. Every now and again, while he was still near enough, they caught a glint and a twinkle as he stumbled on some golden thing. The light grew smaller as he wandered away into the vast hall, then it began to rise, dancing into the air. Bilbo was climbing the great mound of treasure. Soon he stood upon the top, and still went on. Then they saw him halt and stop for a moment, but they did not know the reason. It was the Arkenstone, the heart of the mountain, so Bilbo guessed from Thorin's description. But indeed, there could be no two such gems, even in so marvelous a hoard, even in all the world. Let me pause there. I don't like to pause in the middle of a paragraph, but this is another indication that it's not a Silmaril. There's only one, and there is none like it, even in the whole world. So not in the sky, not in the seas, not in the the earth. It's not a Silmaril. I know that I seem to be coming back to this time and time again, but it's just this thing that won't go away. Sort of like, why didn't they just fly the eagles to Mordor, you know? One of those questions that just won't die. And I'd like to kill this question the way that the Balrogs killed Fingon. To smash it into dust and to tread in its waste. That would be what I'd like to do to the question of whether or not the Arkenstone is a Silmaril. It's not. Ever as he climbed, the same white gleam had shone before him and drawn his feet towards it. Slowly it grew to a little globe of pallid light. Now as he came near, it was tinged with a flickering sparkle of many colors at the surface, reflected and splintered from the wavering light of his torch. At last he looked down upon it, and he caught his breath. The great jewel shone before his feet, of his own inner light, and yet cut and fashioned by the dwarves who had dug it from the heart of the mountain long ago. It took all light that fell upon it and changed it into 10,000 sparks of white radiance, shot with glints of the rainbow. Suddenly Bilbo's arm went towards it, drawn by its enchantment. His small hand would not close about it, for it was large and heavy gem, but he lifted it, shut his eyes, and put it in his deepest pocket. Now I am a burglar indeed, thought he. But I suppose I must tell the dwarves about it, sometime. They did say I could pick and choose my own share, and I think I should choose this if they took all the rest. All the same, he had an uncomfortable feeling that the picking and choosing had not really been meant to include this marvelous gem, and that trouble would yet come of it. Now he went on again. Down the other side of the great mound he climbed, and the spark of his torch vanished from the sight of the watching dwarves. But soon they saw it far away in the distance again. Bilbo was crossing the floor of the hall. He went on till he came to the great doors at the further side, and there a draught of air refreshed him, but it almost puffed out his light. He peeped timidly through, and caught a glimpse of great passages and the dim beginnings of wide stairs going up into the gloom. And still there was no sight nor sound of Smaug. He was just going to turn and go back when a black shape swooped at him and brushed his face. He squeaked and started, stumbled backwards and fell. His torch dropped head downwards and went out. "Only a bat, I suppose, and hope," he said miserably. "But now what am I to do? Which is east, south, north, or west?" "Thorin, Balin, Oin, Gloin, Filly, Killy," he cried as loudly as he could. It seemed a thin little noise in the wide blackness. "The light's gone out! Someone come and find me and help me!" For the moment his courage had failed altogether. Faintly the dwarves heard his small cries, though the only word they could catch was help. "Now what on earth or under it has happened?" said Thorin. "Certainly not the dragon, or he would not go on squeaking." They waited a moment or two, and still there were no dragon noises, or sound at all, in fact, but Bilbo's distant voice. "Come, one of you, get another light or two," Thorin ordered. "It seems we've got to go and help our burglar." "It is about our time to help," said Balin, "as I am quite willing to go. Anyway, I expect it is safe for the moment." Gloin lit several more torches. Then they all crept out one by one and went along the wall as hurriedly as they could. It was not long before they met Bilbo himself coming back towards them. His wits had quickly returned as soon as he saw the twinkle of their lights. "Only a bat and a dropped torch, nothing worse," he said in answer to their questions. Though they were much relieved, they were inclined to be grumpy at being frightened for nothing. But what could they have said if he had told them that at that moment about the Arkenstone, I don't know. The mere fleeting glimpses of treasure which they had caught as they went along had rekindled all the fire of their dwarfish hearts. And when the heart of a dwarf, even the most respectable, is wakened by gold and by jewels, he grows suddenly bold, and he may become fierce. The dwarves indeed no longer needed any urging. All now were eager to explore the hall while they had the chance, and willing to believe that for the present Smaug was away from home. Each now gripped a lighted torch, and as they gazed, first on one side and then on the other, they forgot fear and even caution. They spoke aloud and cried out to one another, and they lifted old treasures from the mound or from the wall, and held them in the light, caressing and fingering them. Filly and Killy were almost in a merry mood, and finding still hanging many golden harps strung with silver, they took them and struck them, and being magical and also untouched by the dragon, who had small interest in music, they were still in tune. The dark hall was filled with a melody that had long been silent. But most of the dwarves were more practical. They gathered gems and stuffed their pockets, and let what they could not carry fall back through their fingers with a sigh. Thorin was not least among these, but always he searched side to side for something that he could not find. It was the Arkenstone, but he spoke of it, yet to no one. Now the dwarves took down mail and weapons from the walls and armed themselves. Royal indeed did Thorin look, clad in a coat of gold-plated rings, with a silver-hafted axe and a belt crusted with scarlet stones. "Mr. Baggins," he cried out, "here is my first payment of your reward. Cast off your old coat and put on this." With that he put on Bilbo a small coat of mail wrought for some young elf prince long ago. It was of silver steel, which the elves call mithril, and with it went a belt of pearls and crystals. A light helm of figured leather strengthened beneath it with hoops of steel, and studded about the brim with white gems was set upon the hobbit's head. "I feel magnificent," he thought, "but I expect I look rather absurd. How they would laugh on the hill at home. Still, I wish there was a looking-glass handy." All the same, Mr. Baggins kept his head more clear of the bewitchment of the hoard than the dwarves did. Long before the dwarves were tired of examining the treasures, he became weary of it, and sat down on the floor, and he began to wonder nervously what the end of it all would be. I would give a good many of these precious goblets, he thought, for a drink of something cheering out of one of Bjorn's wooden bowls. "Thorin," he cried aloud, "what next? We are armed, but what good has any armor ever been before against Smaug the Dreadful? This treasure is not yet won back. We are not looking for gold yet, but a way of escape, and we have tempted luck too long." "You speak the truth," answered Thorin, recovering his wits. "Let us go. I will guide you. Not in 1,000 years should I forget the ways of this palace." Then he hailed the others, and they gathered together. And holding their torches above their heads, they passed through the gaping doors, not without many a backward glance of longing. Their glittering mail they had covered again with their old cloaks, and their bright helms, and their tattered hoods, and one by one they walked behind Thorin, a line of little lights in the darkness that halted often, listening in fear once more for any rumor of the dragon's coming. Through all the old adornments were long mouldered or destroyed, and though all was befouled and blasted with the comings and goings of the monster, Thorin knew every passage and every turn. They climbed long stairs, and turned and went down wide echoing ways, and turned again, and climbed yet more stairs, and yet more stairs again. These were smooth, cut out of the living rock, broad and fair, and up the dwarves went, and they met no sign of any living thing, only furtive shadows that fled from the approach of their torches fluttering in the draughts. The steps were not made, all the same, for hobbit legs, and Bilbo was just feeling that he could go on no longer when suddenly the roof sprang high and far beyond the reach of their torchlight. A white glimmer could be seen coming through some opening far above, and the air smelt sweeter. Before them light came dimly through great doors that hung twisted in their chambers and half-burnt. "This is the great chamber of Thror," said Thorin. "The hall of feasting and of council. Not far off now is the front gate." Okay. So to pause here, the biggest thing here to talk about is the mithril coat. So Thorin gives Bilbo a coat made of mithril, and it's mentioned that it was made for some elf prince long ago. Obviously, it was never delivered, whether there was a lack of payment or it wasn't finished in time when the dragon came. But mithril, we don't really know much about it. It's called, I think he said silvered steel. Let me go back to that. And of course mentioned the elvish term, mithril. Where was that? Oh, here we are. Silver steel. Silver steel suggests that mithril might be some sort of alloy. But we learned that it is an ore, and it does come from underground, and that usually from Moria, although there was mithril in Numenor, which is long gone, and there is mithril in the Undying Lands, which is sundered from the world at this point. We know for a fact it has to have been mithril in the Undying Lands, because they made Earendil a ship made out of mithril. Even the sails were made out of mithril, and the ship flew through the air. That was the Vingulot. But anyway, mithril, myth means gray, and it's cinder in Elvish, and rill is brilliance. I talked about that before with Silmaril. What's interesting here, though, is we don't really get much information about. We aren't told the properties of mithril. And yes, that is true. He called it true silver, or sometimes Moria silver. But this is the Hobbit. This is a little bit more primitive. We were not told about how light it is, or how beautiful it is, or how strong it is. All of the properties of the mithril coat, including the great expense that Gandalf said that it was worth more than the Shire, and that everything in the Shire included. When Gimli heard that Thorin had given Bilbo a coat of mithril, he called it a kingly gift indeed. All of that was made later, and I think the reason is because the mithril coat became sort of this thing that, not exactly a deus ex machina, but an important plot device for Frodo, for him to get speared and shot with arrows and to come out okay, for Saruman to try to stab him and for him to be fine, the blade snapped. But what's interesting is that Bilbo leaves everything to Frodo, but with not a few things that, there were a few things he took with him. And one of them was the mithril coat. Now, he didn't have the mithril coat in Bag End at the time. The mithril coat was actually in a museum in the Shire, in the capital of the Shire, which was called Meikledelving. And there's a museum there, and the mithril coat was there. It was on loan, and that Bilbo actually retrieved it from the museum before he departed from the Shire and took it with him. And that's why he was able to give the coat to Frodo when Frodo reached Rivendell. Now, you might wonder, if Bilbo was going to give Frodo this mithril coat, why wait until Book 2? Why wait until the beginning of Book 2 when Frodo's in Rivendell, when the whole point of Bilbo giving up his wealth was that he was giving everything, the house, the money, everything, to Frodo? Why not do it at the beginning of Book 1? And it's simple, because the Witch King had to stab Frodo, and that was important. So, and then of course Bilbo is suddenly feeling very guilty. If you read between the lines there, when we get to the Fellowship of the Ring, you'll see that he was feeling very guilty that if he had given this mithril coat to Frodo sooner, he would have been okay. He would not have been stabbed in such a manner. Okay, let's continue along here. They passed through the ruined chamber. Tables were rotting there. Chairs and benches were lying there, overturned, charred, and decaying. Skulls and bones were upon the floor, among flagons and bowls and broken drinking horns and dust. As they came through yet more doors at the further end, a sound of water fell upon their ears, and the grey light grew suddenly more full. "There is the birth of the running river," said Thorin. "From here it hastens to the gate. Let us follow it." Out of a dark opening in a wall of rock there issued a boiling water, and it flowed swirling into a narrow channel, carved and made straight and deep by the cunning of ancient hands. Beside it ran a stone-paved road wide enough for many men abreast. Swiftly along this they ran, and round a wide sweeping turn, and behold, before them stood the broad light of day. In front there rose a tall arch, still showing the fragments of old carven work within, worn and splintered and blackened though it was. A misty sun sent its pale light between the arms of the mountains, and beams of gold fell on the pavement of the threshold. A whirl of bats frightened them from slumber by their smoking torches flurried over them. As they sprang forward, their feet slithered on stones, rubbed smooth and slime by the passing of the dragon. Now before them the water fell noisily outward and foamed down toward the valley. They flung their pale torches to the ground and stood gazing out with dazzled eyes. They were come to the front gate, and were looking out upon Dale. "Well," said Bilbo, "I never expected to be looking out of this door. I never expected to be so pleased to see the sun again, and to feel the wind on my face. But how this wind is cold." It was. A bitter easterly breeze blew with the threat of oncoming winter. It swirled over round the arms of the mountain into the valley, and sighed among the rocks. After their long time in the stewing depths of the dragon-haunted caverns, they shivered in the sun. Suddenly Bilbo realized that he was not only tired, but also very hungry indeed. "It seems to be late morning," he said, "and so I suppose it is more or less breakfast time, if there is any breakfast to have, but I don't feel that Smaug's front doorstep is the safest place for a meal. Do let's go somewhere where we can sit quiet for a bit." "Quite right," said Balin, "and I think I know which way we should go. We ought to make for the old lookout post in the southwest corner of the mountain." "How far is that?" asked the Hobbit. 5 hours' march, I should think. It'll be rough going. The road from the gate along the left edge of the stream seems all broken up. But look down there, the river loops suddenly east across dale in the front of the ruined town. At that point there was once a bridge leading to a steep stair that climbed over the right bank, and so to a road running towards Ravenhill. There is, or was, a path that left the road and climbed up to that point. A hard climb, too, even if the old steps are still there. Dear me, grumbled the Hobbit. More walking and more climbing without breakfast. I wonder how many breakfasts and other meals we have missed inside that nasty, clockless, timeless hole. As a matter of fact, 2 nights and the day between them had gone by, and not altogether without food, since the dragon smashed the magic door, but Bilbo quite lost count. And it might have been 1 night or a week of nights, for all he could tell. Come, come, said Thorin, laughing. His spirits had begun to rise again, and he rattled the precious stones in his pockets. Don't call my place a nasty hole. You wait till it has been cleaned and redecorated. That won't be till Smaug's dead, said Bilbo glumly. In the meantime, where is he? I would give a good breakfast to know. I hope he's not up on the mountain looking down at us. That idea disturbed the dwarves mightily, and they quickly decided that Bilbo and Balin were right. We must move away from here, said Dori. I feel if his eyes were on the back of my head. It is a cold, lonesome place, said Bombur. There may be drink, but I see no signs of food. A dragon would always be hungry in such parts. Come on, cried the others. Let us follow Balin's path. Under the rocky wall to the right there was no path, and on they trudged among the stones on the left side of the river, and the emptiness and desolation soon sobered even Thorin again. The bridge that Balin had spoken of they found long fallen, and most of its stones were now only boulders in the shallow, noisy stream. But they forded the water without much difficulty, and found the ancient steps and climbed the high bank. After going a short way, they struck the old road, and before long came to a deep dell, sheltered among the rocks, where they rested for a while and had such breakfast as they could, chiefly cram and water. If you want to know what cram is, I can only say that I don't know the recipe, but it is biscuitish, keeps good indefinitely, is supposed to be sustaining, and is certainly not entertaining, being in fact very uninteresting except as a chewing exercise. It was made by the lakemen for such long journeys. I need to pause to drink water here. I'm also going to talk about cram. So cram, from the description that Tolkien gives it, seems to be a form of hardtack, which is a very, very dense biscuit that sailors would take on their journeys that was not quite nutritionally complete. They had to bring fruit with them so that they wouldn't get scurvy, but it was close to it. And yes, and soldiers, of course, used it as well, hardtack. Gimli makes mention of cram in the Fellowship of the Ring in Book 2 when they're in Lothlorien. And he sees one of the lembas cakes, and he thinks it's cram, and so he crams it into his mouth whole. When he takes a little bite, and he realizes it's delicious, he eats the whole thing. And the elves are kind of like, whoa, slow down there, big guy. You just ate a week's worth of food. Of course, usually it was unsafe to eat because of the worms. The lembas bread, I could talk about that quite a lot. I'm not going to get into it here because it's not relevant for The Hobbit, but I'll give the whole history of it when we read The Fellowship of the Ring. I was asked once on Quora what a recipe would be like for lembas, and I said, see, here's the thing. No matter what you make, there are lots of lembas recipes out there on the internet, but you're going to be missing one important ingredient: magic. Because it's not just merely... not merely just nutritionally complete, it's also magical, and we hear of it not just in the Fellowship of the Ring, but and Lord of the Rings in general, but in the Fall of Gondolin as well, we hear of the magic of lembas. And yes, he spent a lot of time in trenches, in the Somme and such, so yeah. I've never had hardtack, so... I've had something similar once, but it was not pleasant. Okay. But that's basically what cram is. It appears to be something very much like hardtack. After that they went on again, and now the road struck westwards and left the river, and the great shoulder of the south-pointing mountain spur drew ever nearer. At length they reached the hill path, It scrambled steeply up, and they plodded slowly one behind the other, till last in the late afternoon they came to the top of the ridge and saw the wintry sun going downwards to the west. Here they found a flat place, without a wall on 3 sides, but back to the north by a rocky face in which there was an opening, like a door. From that door there was a wide view east and south and west. Here, said Balin, in the old days, we used to always keep watchmen, so that the door behind leads to a rock-hewn chamber that was made here as a guard-room. There were several places like it round the mountain, but there seemed small need for watching in the days of our prosperity, and the guards were made over-comfortable, perhaps. Otherwise we might have had longer warning of the coming of the dragon, and things might have been different. Still, here we can now lie hidden and sheltered for a while, and we can see much without being seen. Not much use if we have been seen coming here, said Dori, who was always looking up toward the mountain's peak, as if he expected to see Smaug perched there like a bird on a steeple. We must take our chance of that, said Thorin. We can go no further today. Here, here, cried Bilbo, and flung himself on the ground. In the rock chamber there would have been a room for 100, and there was a small chamber further in, more removed from the cold outside. It was quite deserted. Not even wild animals seemed to have used it at all in the days of Smaug's dominion. There they laid their burdens, and some threw themselves down at once and slept, but the others sat near the outer door and discussed their plans. In all their talk they came perpetually back to one thing: where was Smaug? They looked west, and there was nothing, and east there was nothing, and in the south there was no sign of the dragon, and there was a gathering of very many birds. At that they gazed and wondered, but there was no nearer to understanding it when the first cold stars came out. Oh, so that's the end of the chapter there. Yeah, I might have seen the same video. Let me take a look. Yes, I have watched that video. I have seen that. And what's interesting, though, is if you look at just even the thumbnail of the picture of the hardtack biscuit, it doesn't look that different from the description that he gave of what Lembas looked like. So you could understand that while Lembas was much more pleasant to eat, it did look like Cram. And that makes an explanation as to why Gimli would think it was Cram. Chapter 14, Fire and Water. Now, if you wish, like the dwarves, to hear news of Smaug, you must go back again to the evening when he smashed the door and flew off in a rage 2 days before. The men of the lake town Esgaroth were mostly indoors, for the breeze was from the black east and chill. But a few were talking in the quays and watching, as they were fond of doing, the stars shine out from the smooth patches of the lake as they opened in the sky. From their town the lonely mountain was mostly screened by the low hills in the far end of the lake, through a gap in which the running river came down from the north. Only its high peak could they see in clear weather, and they looked seldom at it, for it was ominous and drear even in the light of morning. Now it was lost and gone, blotted in the dark. Suddenly it flickered back into view. A brief glow touched it and faded. "Look," said one, "the lights again. Last night the watchman saw them start and fade from midnight until dawn. Something is happening up there." "Perhaps the king under the mountain is forging gold," said another. "It is long since he went north. It is time the songs began to prove themselves again." "Which king?" said another, with a grim voice. "As like as not in the marauding fire of the dragon, the only king under the mountain we have ever known." "You're always foreboding gloomy things," said the other. "Anything from floods to poisoned fish. Think of something cheerful." Then suddenly a great light appeared in the low place of the hills, and the northern end of the lake turned golden. "The king beneath the mountain," they shouted. "His wealth is like the sun, his silver like a fountain, his rivers golden run. The river is running gold from the mountain," they cried, and everywhere windows were opening and feet were hurrying. There was once more a tremendous excitement and enthusiasm, but the grim-voiced fellow ran hot-foot to the master. "The dragon is coming, or I'm a fool," he cried. "Cut the bridges! To arms! To arms!" Then warning trumpets were suddenly sounded and echoed along the rocky shores. The cheering stopped, and the joy was turned to dread. So it was that the dragon did not find them quite unprepared. Before long, so great was his speed that they could see him, as a spark of fire rushing toward them and growing ever huger and more bright. And not the most foolish doubted that the prophecies had gone rather wrong. Still they had little time. Every vessel in the town was filled with water, every warrior was armed, every arrow and dart was ready, and the bridge to the land was thrown down and destroyed before the roar of Smaug's terrible approach grew loud, and the lake rippled as red as fire beneath the awful beating of his wings. Amid shrieks and wailing, and the shouts of men, he came over them, swept towards the bridges, and was foiled. The bridge was gone, and his enemies were on an island in the deep water, too deep and dark and cool for his liking. If he plunged into it, a vapor and a steam would arise enough to cover all the land with a mist for days. But the lake was mightier than he, and would quench him before he could pass through. Roaring, he swept back over the town. A hail of dark arrows leaped up and snapped and rattled on his scales and jewels, and their shafts fell back, kindled by his breath, burning and hissing to the lake. No fireworks you ever imagined equaled the sights of that night. At the twanging of the bows and the shrilling of the trumpets, the dragon's wrath blazed to its height, till he was blind and mad with it. No one had dared give battle to him for many an age, nor would they have dared now if it had not been for the grim-voiced man, Bard was his name, who ran to and fro, cheering on the archers and urging the master to order them to fight to the last arrow. Fire leaped from the dragon's jaws. He circled for a while high in the air upon them, lighting all the lake. The trees by the shore shone like copper and like blood, with leaping shadows of dense black at their feet. Then down he swooped straight through the arrow storm, reckless in his rage, taking no heed to turn his scaly sides towards his foes, seeking only to set their town ablaze. Fire leaped from thatched roofs and wooden beam ends as he hurled down and passed and round again, though all had been drenched with water before he came. Once more water was flung by 100 hands wherever a spark appeared. Back swirled the dragon. A sweep of his tail, and the roof of his great house crumbled and smashed down. Flames unquenchable sprang high into the night. Another swoop and another house, and then another sprang afire and fell, and still no arrow hindered Smaug or hurt him more than a fly from the marshes. Already men were jumping into the water on every side. Women and children were being huddled into laden boats in the market pool. Weapons were flung down. There was mourning and weeping, where but a little time ago the old songs of mirth had come to be sung about the dwarves. Now men cursed their names. The master himself was turning to his great gilded boat, hoping to row away in the confusion and save himself. Soon all the town would be deserted and burned down to the surface of the lake. That was the dragon's hope. They could all get into the boats for all he cared. There he could have fine sport hunting them. Or they could stop till they starved. Let them try to get to land, and he would be ready. Soon he would set all the shoreland woods ablaze, and wither every field and pasture. Just now he was enjoying the sport of town baiting more than he had enjoyed anything for years. But there was still a company of archers that held their ground among the burning houses. Their captain was Bard, grim-voiced and grim-faced, whose friends had accused him of prophesying floods and poisoned fish, though they knew his worth and courage. He was a descendant in long line of Giri and long of Lord of Dale, whose wife and child had escaped down the running river from the ruin long ago. Now he shot with a great yew bow till all his arrows but one were spent. The flames were near to him. His companions were leaving him. He bent his bow for the last time. Suddenly, out of the dark, something fluttered to his shoulder. He started, but it was only an old thrush. Unafraid, it perched by his ear, and it brought him news. Marveling, he found that he could understand its language, for he was of the race of Dale. "Wait, wait," it said to him. "The moon is rising. Look for the hollow in the left breast as he flies and turns above you." And while Bard paused in wonder, it told him the tidings up in the mountain, and all that it had heard. Then Bard drew his bowstring to his ear. The dragon was circling back, flying low. As he came, the moon rose above the eastern shore and silvered his great wings. "Arrow," said the bowman. "Black Arrow, I have saved you to the last. You have never failed me, and always have I recovered you. I had you from my father, and he from of old. If you ever came from the forges of the true king under the mountain, go now and speed well." The dragon swooped once more lower than ever, and as he turned and dived down, his belly glittered with sparkling fires of gems in the moon. But not in one place. The great bow twanged. The black arrow sped straight from the string, straight for the hollow by the left breast, where the foreleg was flung wide. In it smote and vanished barb, shaft, and feather, so fierce was its flight. With a shriek that deafened men, felled trees, and split stones, Smaug shot, spouting into the air, turned over, and crashed down from on high in ruin. Full on the town he fell. His last throws splintered in sparks and gleeds. The lake roared in. A vast steam leaped up, white in the sudden dark under the moon. There was a hiss, a gushing whirl, and then silence. And that was the end of Smaug and Esgaroth, but not of Bard. Okay. That was exciting. Let's pause to discuss the Black Arrow here. So the Black Arrow is something interesting, and I had we'll say a heated disagreement once with someone on Quora who insisted that dragons could only be killed by these special black arrows, and I brought up, well, that's not how they killed Skaitha, that's not how they killed Ancalagon, that's not how they killed Glaurung. Smaug was the only dragon to have been slain by such an arrow. And there's really nothing special about it other than the fact that it is a black arrow, which could mean that it is painted black, or it could mean that it is made out of black iron. We don't really know, and that it is very old. Now, he does mention that it may have come from the forges of the king under the mountain. It may have come from of Erebor itself, and therefore would be of dwarven make, and therefore of extremely high quality. He mentions that he's always retrieved it. He's not going to retrieve it now. Smaug is in the lake. I mean, he crashed down into the town. The town crashed down into the lake. He's dead and gone. That's it. And there's a passage a bit later that mentions nobody touches his remains. That they're considered cursed. So, yeah, it's not so much that the arrow was anything that special. It's not like the movie, is what I'm saying, where there were special black arrows that were dragon killing tools. But what's special is that he got special information from the Thrush, who got it from Bilbo. And what's interesting is that now we're told, the left breast, we're told that this patch here, if you imagine that I'm a dragon, this section here is where he's not armored, which is right where, your heart would be. But the description of how the arrow pierced him seemed that it came in from the side like this. And if this is bypassing rib cages and everything, that is a killing shot, and the arrow went completely into the dragon. The shaft, the feathers, everything. So this was definitely, he was dead before he hit the ground. It was over for him. The waxing moon rose higher and higher as the wind grew loud and cold. It twisted the white fog into bending pillars and hurrying clouds and drove it off to the west, to scatter in tattered shreds over the marshes before Mirkwood. Then the many boats could be seen dotted dark on the surface of the lake, and down the wind came the voices of the people of Esgaroth, lamenting their lost town, and goods, and ruined houses. But they had really much to be thankful for, had they thought of it. Though it could hardly be expected that they should just then. 3/4 of the people of the town had at least escaped alive. Their woods and fields and pastures and cattle and most of their boats remained undamaged, and the dragon was dead. What that meant they had not yet realized. They gathered in mournful crowds upon the western shores, shivering in the cold wind, and their first complaints and anger were against the master, who had left the town so soon, while some were still willing to defend it. He may have had a good head for business, especially his own business, some murmured. But he's no good when anything serious happens, and they praised the courage of Bard in his last mighty shot. If only he had not been killed, they all said, we would have made him a king. Bard, the dragon shooter of the line of Girion, alas that he is lost. And in the very midst of their talk, a tall figure stepped from the shadows. He was drenched with water. His black hair hung wet over his face and shoulders, and a fierce light was in his eyes. Bard is not lost, he cried. He dived from Esgaroth when the enemy was slain. I am Bard of the line of Girion. I am the slayer of the dragon. King Bard, they shouted, but the master ground his chattering teeth. Girion was lord of Dale, not king of Esgaroth, he said. In the lake town we have always elected masters from among the old and wise, and have not endured the rule of mere fighting men. Let King Bard go back to his own kingdom. Dale is now freed by his valor, and nothing hinders his return. And any that wish can go with him, if they prefer the cold stones under the shadow of the mountain to the green shores of the lake. The wise will stay here and hope to rebuild our town and enjoy it again, in time, its peace and riches. We will have King Bard, the people near at hand shouted in reply. We have had enough of the old men and money counters. and people further off took up to the cry, "Up the bowmen, and down with money bags," till the clamor echoed along the shore. "I am the last man to undervalue Bard the bowman," said the master warily, for Bard now stood close beside him. "He has tonight earned an eminent place in the toll of the benefactors of our town, and he is worthy of many imperishable songs. But why, O people?" And here the master rose to his feet and spoke very loud and clear. "Why do I get all your blame? For what fault am I to be deposed? Who aroused the dragon from his slumber, I might ask? Who obtained of us rich gifts and ample help, and led us to believe that old songs could come true? Who played on our soft hearts and our pleasant fancies? What sort of gold have they sent down the river to reward us, dragon fire and ruin? From whom should we claim our recompense of our damage, and aid of our widows and orphans?" As you see, the master had not got his position for nothing. The result of his words were that for the moment the people quite forgot their idea of a new king, and turned their angry thoughts toward Thorin and his company. Wild and bitter words were shouted from many sides, and some of those who had before sung the old songs loudest were now heard as loudly crying that the dwarves had stirred the dragon up against them deliberately. "Fools," said Bard, "why waste words in wrath on those unhappy creatures? Doubtless they perished first in the fire before Smaug came to us." Then even as he was speaking, the thought came to his heart of the fabled treasure of the mountain lying without guard or owner, and he fell suddenly silent. He thought of the master's words, and of Dale rebuilt and filled with golden bells, if he could but find the men. At length he spoke again. "This is no time for angry words, master, or for considering weighty plans of change. There is work to do. I serve you still, though after a while I may think again of your words and go north with any that will follow me." Then he strode off to help in the ordering of the camps and the care of the sick and the wounded, but the master scowled at his back as he went, and remained sitting on the ground. He thought much, but said little, unless it was to call loudly for men to bring him fire and food. Okay, to pause here, I have things to say. Let me just catch up here on chat a little bit here. Yeah, it could have been destined, but what I was trying to get at was that it was not especially magical or anything like that. There is prophecy in Tolkien's work, but there is not special dragon killing arrows, especially the thought that only these special dragon killing arrows could kill a dragon. I mean, like I said, of course it killed him immediately. Like I said, it came into his heart from the side. It was unimpeded. Bilbo was just as important in this as anybody, because he was the one that discovered the dragon's weakness. Now, what I wanted to talk about here is, like I said, Tolkien did not write allegory, but he did put his thoughts into it, and you can see here, up with Bard, down with Moneybags. Once again, his thoughts on wealthy old men, and what we see here is the master being portrayed as this career politician and Bard as this fighting man. And the master is very shrewd here, and he blames it all on Thor and everybody. He's sort of a populist. He's extremely greedy. He's very good at deflecting any sort of blame. Not that he really is to blame here, but he was trying to escape. He had a gilded boat. That just sounds dumb. That sounds like it's gonna sink, and he doesn't end up anywhere good. The master, he's not that unlike Smaug himself. He's greedy. He loves gold. He's good at talking. He's good at convincing. He's a cajoler. He's charismatic. He's a politician, is what he is. Whereas Bard is sort of the more traditional. We choose him as king because he's the best and the strongest and the bravest. And, Tolkien had these thoughts on kings. And you don't usually see somebody that is thought to be worthy of being a king just because they were born a certain way. Now, surely like Aragorn, for example, is the heir of Isildur and Anarion. But that's not enough. And it's explained rather explicitly in The Return of the King that that's not enough to make him the king. He has to fulfill many, many prophecies to become the king. And we'll talk about that when we get to that point, of course, in greater detail. But if you notice, the The kings of men and elves and dwarves all earn their positions in different ways. And the ones that are not earned, they don't last very long. The ones like Feanor. Well, Feanor didn't even establish... Could we even really call him a High King of the Noldor? He didn't establish a kingdom in Middle-earth. He got to Middle-earth, and he went straight to Angband and got killed by Balrogs. And, his bloodline... Yeah, it reads weird from the modern perspective. Tolkien was pro-England, but he was anti-imperialist. He grew up as a very young boy in South Africa, and he loved England, but he did not like the British Empire. And his kings, the good kings, are more like Arthur. They're mythical in their own way. And I made this observation many times in relation to the Lord of the Rings and to a lesser extent to the Silmarillion, but you really see it the most in the Lord of the Rings. And you see it a little bit here in the Hobbit as well. The good kings lead in the front when it comes to matters of war, and the bad kings lead from behind. And I don't mean in quality, I mean in temperament. Theoden is in the front when he charges into Pelennor Fields, and he's so swift to ride to his doom even, that nobody could catch up with him. Eowyn almost caught up with him, but he was such a force on the field. Denethor is hiding the whole time. Now, of course, Denethor comes from a line of stewards, and the stewards traditionally were forbidden to ride out for battle. But it's still like showing that like Denethor is this cringing sort of guy, and Theoden is the polar opposite. Sauron is a guy that leads from behind. The good kings like Aragorn and Theoden and Éomer and Gil-galad as well, they all lead in the front. They're all fighting in the front. They're not being protected by their people. Completely idealized, and that's what makes it fantasy. You know what I mean? That's what makes it fantasy. It's like that old video from the epic rap battles of history where it was J.R.R. Tolkien and George R.R. Martin. And one of the lines from Martin was that, in Tolkien's work, all the good guys live and the bad guys die. You could tell what's going to happen by page in age 5. Of course, he's wrong. Not all of the good guys survive. Thorin doesn't survive. Filion Kili doesn't survive. Theoden doesn't survive. Halbarad doesn't survive. Hama doesn't survive. Not Hama. What was that fellow's name that brought the red arrow to Rohan? Hirgon didn't survive. And then in the Silmarillion, there's a literal pile of bodies, a mountain of bodies. All the greatest heroes wind up dying. Even Gil-galad didn't make it out of the Silmarillion. So, it's untrue. But Tolkien's reply to that was that the genre's called fantasy. It's meant to be unrealistic. So, of course, when you're writing fantasy, you can idealize things like kings. Not tell you what they are, but what they ought to be. All right, let's continue along here. Now everywhere Bard went, he found talk running like fire among the people concerning the vast treasure that was now unguarded. Men spoke of recompense for all their harm, and that they would soon get it, and wealth over and to spare, with which to buy rich things from the south. And it cheered them greatly in their plight. That was as well, for the night was bitter and miserable. Shelters could be contrived for few, the master had one, and there was little food, even the master went short. Many took ill of wet and cold and sorrow that night, and afterwards died, who had escaped uninjured from the ruin of the town, and in the days that followed there was much sickness and great hunger. Meanwhile Bard took the lead, and ordered things as he wished, though always in the master's name, and he had a hard task to govern people and direct their preparation for their protection and housing. Probably most of them would have perished in the winter, and now hurried after autumn, if help had not been to hand. But help came swiftly, for Bard at once had speedy messengers sent up the river to the forest to ask aid of the king of the elves of the wood. And these messengers had found a host already on the move. although it was then only a third day after the fall of Smaug. The Elven King had received news from his own messengers, and from the birds that loved his folk, and already knew much of what had happened. Very great indeed was the commotion among all things with wings that dwelt on the borders of the desolation of the dragon. The air was filled with circling flocks, and their swift-flying messengers flew here and there across the sky. Above the borders of the forest there was a whistling, crying, and piping. Far over Mirkwood tidings spread, Smaug is dead. Leaves rustled and startled ears were lifted. Even before the Elven King rode forth, his news had passed west, right to the pine woods of the Misty Mountains. Beorn had heard it in his wooden house, and the goblins were at council in their caves. "That will be the last we shall hear of Thorin Oakenshield, I fear," said the king. "He would have done better to have remained my guest. It was an ill wind all the same," he added, "that blows no one any good." For he too had not forgotten the legend of the wealth of Thror. For so it was that Bard's messengers found him now marching with many spearmen and bowmen, and crows were gathered thick above him, for they thought that war was awakening again, such as had not been in those parts for a long age. But the king, when he received the prayers of Bard, had pity, for he was the lord of a good and kindly people. So turning his march, which had first been direct toward the mountain, he hastened now down the river to the long lake. He had not boats or rafts enough for his host, and they were forced to go slower away by foot. For great store of goods he sent ahead by water. Still elves are light-footed, and though they were not in these days much used to the marches and the treacherous lands between the forest and the lake, their going was swift. Only 5 days after the death of the dragon they came upon the shores and looked upon the ruin of the town. Their welcome was good, as many be expected, and the men and their master were ready to make any bargain for the future and return for the Elven King's aid. Their plans were soon made. With the women and children, the old and the unfit, the master remained behind. Once again, behind. And with him were some men of crafts and many skilled elves, and they busied themselves felling trees and collecting the timber sent down from the forest. Then they set about raising many huts by the shore against the oncoming winter, and also, under the master's direction, they began the planning of a new town, designed more fair and large even than before, but not in the same place. They removed northward, higher up the shore, for ever after they had a dread of the water where the dragon lay. He would never again return to his golden bed, but it was stretched, cold as stone, twisted upon the floor of the shallows. There for ages his huge bones could be seen in calm weather, amid the ruined piles of the old town, but few dared to cross this cursed spot, and none dared dive into the shivering water or recover the precious stones that fell from his rotting carcass. But all the men of arms who were still able, and the most of the Elven King's array, got ready to march north to the mountain. It was thus that in 11 days from the ruin of the town, the head of their host passed the rock gates at the end of the lake and came into their desolate lands. Saruman is a good example. Yes, Saruman leads from behind. He doesn't even lead from behind. He leads from afar. He didn't even go to Helm's Deep. So that's the end of that chapter. Not a lot to say that I didn't kind of already say here. But for people who wonder what right had Thranduil to any amount of the treasure, there it is right there. They made a deal with him that he would get some of the treasure as well, that the men were certainly entitled to. After all, they killed the dragon in exchange for their aid, because these lake men probably would have mostly died out if not for Thranduil's intervention. The other thing that I want to mention is that Thranduil is another example of a king who leads from the front. He was present in the battle against Sauron at the end of the Second Age. His father was killed in that battle, and he was the one that led the troops after that, and only a third of them made it back, though. All right, Chapter 15, The Gathering of the Clouds. Now we will return to Bilbo and the dwarves. All night one of them had watched, but when morning came they had not heard nor seen of any danger. But ever more thickly the birds were gathering. Their companies came flying from the south, and the crows that still lived about the mountains were wheeling and crying unceasingly above. "Something strange is happening," said Thorin. "The time has come for the autumn wanderings, and these are birds that dwell always in the land. There are starlings and flocks of finches, and far off there are many carrion birds, as if a battle were afoot." Suddenly Bilbo pointed. "There is that old thrush again," he cried. "He seems to have escaped when Smaug smashed the mountainside, but I don't suppose the snails have." Sure enough, the old thrush was there, and as Bilbo pointed, he flew toward them and perched on a stone nearby. Then he fluttered his wings and sang. Then he cocked his head to one side as if to listen, and then again he sang, but again he listened. "I believe he is trying to tell us something," said Balin, "but I cannot follow the speech of such birds. It is quick and difficult. Can you make it out, Baggins?" "Not very well," said Bilbo. As a matter of fact, he could make nothing of it at all. "But the old fellow seems very excited." "I only wish he were a raven," said Balin. "I thought you did not like them. You seemed very shy of them when we came this way before." "Those were crows. And nasty, suspicious-looking creatures at that, and rude as well. You must have heard the ugly names they were calling after us. But the ravens are different. There used to be great friendship between them and the people of Thror, and they often brought us secret news and were rewarded with such bright things as they coveted to hide in their dwellings. They live many a year, and their memories are long, and they hand on their wisdom to their children. I knew many among the ravens of the rocks when I was a dwarf lad. This very height was once named Ravenhill, because there was a wise and famous pair, Old Kark and his wife, that lived here among the guard chamber, but I don't suppose that any of that legend and ancient breed linger here now." No sooner had he finished speaking than the old thrush gave a loud call and immediately flew away. "We may not understand him, but that old bird understands us, I am sure," said Balin. "Keep watch now and see what happens." Before long there was a fluttering of wings, and back came the thrush, and with him came a most decrepit old bird. He was getting blind, he could hardly fly, and the top of his head was bald. He was an aged raven of great size. He alighted stiffly on the ground before them, slowly flapped his wings, and bobbed towards Thorin. "O Thorin, son of Thrain, and Balin, son of Fundin," he croaked, and Bilbo could understand what he said, for he used ordinary language and not bird speech. "I am Roak, son of Kark. Kark is dead, but he was well known to you once. It is 100 years and 53 since I came out of the egg, but I do not forget what my father told me. Now I am chief of the great ravens of the mountain. We are few, but we still remember the king of old. Most of my people were abroad, for there are great tidings in the south, some tidings of joy to you, and some tidings you will not think so good. Behold, the birds are gathering back again to the mountain and to dale from south and east and west, for word has gone out that Smaug is dead." "Dead, dead," shouted the dwarfs. "Dead? Then we have been in needless fear, and the treasure is ours." They all sprang up and began to caper about for joy. "Yes, dead," said Roak. "The thrush, may his feathers never fall, saw him die, and we may trust his words. He saw him fall in battle with the men of Esgaroth, the third night back from now at the rising of the moon." It was some time before Thorin could bring the dwarfs to be silent and listen to the raven's news. At length, when he had told all the tale of the battle that went on. "So much for joy, Thorin Oakenshield. You may go back to your halls in safety. All the treasure is yours for the moment. But many are gathering hither beside the birds. The news of the death of the Guardian has already gone far and wide, and the legend of the wealth of Thror has not lost in the telling during many years. Many are eager for a share of the spoil. Already a host of the elves is on the way, and carrion birds are with them, hoping for battle and slaughter. By the lake men murmur that their sorrows are due to the dwarves, and they are homeless, and many have died, and Smaug has destroyed their town. They too think to find amends from your treasure, whether you are alive or dead. Your own wisdom must decide your course, but 13 is a small remnant of the great folk of Durin that once dwelt here, and are now scattered far. If you will listen to my counsel, you will not trust the master of Lakemen, but rather him that shot the dragon with his bow. Bard is he, of the race of Dale, of the line of Girion. He is a grim man, but true. We would see out peace once more among dwarves and men and elves after this long desolation, but it may cost you dear in gold. I have spoken." Then Thorin burst forth in anger. "Our thanks, Roak, Kark's son. You and your people shall not be forgotten, but none of our gold shall thieves take, or the violent carry off while we are alive. If you would earn our thanks still more, bring us news of any that draw near. Also, I would beg of you, if any of you are still young and strong of wing, then you would send messengers to our kin in the mountains of the north, both west from here and east, and tell them of our plight, but go especially to my cousin Dane in the Iron Hills, for he has many people well armed and dwells nearest to this place. Bid him hasten." "I will not say if this counsel be good or bad," croaked Roak, "but I will do what can be done." Then off he slowly flew. "Back now to the mountains," cried Thorin. "We have little time to lose." "And little food to use," cried Bilbo, always practical on such points. In any case, he felt that the adventure was, properly speaking, over with the death of the dragon, in which he was much mistaken, and he would have given most of his share of the profits for that peaceful winding up of these affairs. "Back to the mountain," cried the dwarves, as if they had not heard him, so back he had to go with them. Cinnamon apple, and it's disgusting. It tastes like a scented candle. Oh no. That's like Sunny D. Somebody once said that Sunny D tastes like if orange juice was made by a chemist and a florist. Yeah, the snails. That is a fun. Bilbo's full of funny remarks like that. He's just thinking of those snails. The snails are definitely dead. As you've heard some of the events already, you will see that the dwarves still had some days before them. They explored the caverns once more and found, as they expected, that only the front gate remained open. All the other gates, except of course the small secret door, had long ago been broken and blocked by Smaug, and no sign of them remained. So now they began to labor hard in fortifying the main entrance and making a new path that led from it. Tools were to be found in plenty that the miners and quarriers and builders of old had used, and such work that the dwarves were still very skilled. As they worked, the ravens brought them constant tidings. In this way they learned that the Elven King had turned aside to the lake, and they still had breathing space. Better still, they heard that 3 of their ponies had escaped and were wandering far wild down the banks of the running river, not far from where the rest of the storers had been left. So while the others went on their work, Fili and Kili were sent, guarded by a raven, to find the ponies and bring back all they could. They were 4 days gone, and by that time they knew that the joined armies of the lake men and the elves were hurrying toward the mountain. But now their hopes were higher, for they had food for some weeks with care. Chiefly cram, of course, and they were very tired of it. Cram is much better than nothing. And already the gate was blocked with a wall of squared stones laid dry, but very thick and high across the opening. There were holes in the wall through which they could see or shoot, but no entrance. They climbed in or out with ladders and hauled stuff up with ropes. For the issuing of the stream they had contrived a small low arch under the new wall, but near the entrance they had so altered the narrow bed that a wide pool stretched from the mountain wall to the head of the fall, where the stream went toward Dale. Approaching to the gate was now only possible without swimming along a narrow ledge of the cliff to the right, as one looked outward from the wall. The ponies they had brought only to the head of the steps and above the bridge, and unloading them they had bidden them return to their masters, and sent them back riderless to the south. There came a night when suddenly there were many lights as of fires and torches away south and Dale before them. "They have come," called Balin, "and their camp is very great. They must have come to the valley under the cover of dusk, along both banks of the river." That night the dwarves slept little. The morning was still pale when they saw a company approaching. From behind their wall they watched them come up to the valley's head and climb slowly up. Before long they can see that both men of the lake, armed as if for war, and elvish bowmen were among them. At length the foremost of these climbed the tumbled rocks and appeared at the top of the falls, and very great was their surprise to see the pool before them and the gate blocked with a wall of new-hewn stone. As they stood pointing and speaking to one another, Thorin hailed to them. "Who are you," he called in a very loud voice, "that come as if in war to the gates of Thorin, son of Thrain, king under the mountain, and what do you desire?" But they answered nothing. Some turned swiftly back, and others, after gazing for a while at the gate and its defenses, soon followed them. That day the camp was moved to the east of the river, right between the arms of the mountain. The rocks echoed then with voices and with song, and they had not done for many a day. There was the sound, too, of elven harps and of sweet music, and it echoed up toward them. It seemed that the chill of the air was warmed, and they caught faintly the fragrance of woodland flowers blossoming in spring. Then Bilbo longed to escape from the dark fortress and to go down and join in the mirth and feasting by the fires. Some of the younger dwarves were moved in their hearts, too, and they muttered that they wished things had fallen out otherwise, and that they might welcome such folks as friends. But Thorin scowled. Then the dwarves themselves brought forth harps and instruments regained from the hoard, and made music to soften his mood, but their song was not as elvish song, and was very much like the song they had sung long before in Bilbo's little hobbit hole. Under the mountain, dark and tall, the king is come into his hall. His foe is dead, the worm of dread, and ever so his foes shall fall. The sword is sharp, the spear is long, the arrow swift, the gate is strong. The heart is bold, it looks on gold, the dwarves no more shall suffer wrong. The dwarves of yore made mighty spells, while hammers fell like ringing bells, in places deep where dark things sleep, in hollow halls beneath the fells. On silver necklaces they strung, the light of stars on crowns they hung, the dragon fire from twisted wire, the melody of harps they rung. The mountain throne once more is freed. Oh, wandering folk,
the summons heed. Come haste across the waste, the king of friend and kin his need. Now call we over mountains cold, come back to the caverns old. Here at the gates the king awaits, his hands are rich with gems and gold. The king is come into his hall, under mountain and dark and tall. The worm of dread is slain and dead, and ever so our foes shall fall. This song appeared to please Thorin, and he smiled again and grew merry, and he began reckoning the distance to the Iron Hills and how long it would be before Dane could reach the Lonely Mountain, if he set out as soon as the message reached him. But Bilbo's heart fell, both at the song and the talk. They sounded much too warlike. The next morning, early, a company of spearmen was seen crossing the river and marching up the valley. They bore with them the green banner of the Elven King and the blue banner of the lake, and they advanced until they stood right before the wall of the gate. Again Thorin hailed them in a loud voice, "Who are you that come armed for war, to the gates of Thorin, son of Thrain, king under the mountain?" This time he was answered. A tall man stood forward, dark of hair and grim of face, and he cried, "Hail, Thorin! Why do you fence yourself like a robber in his hold? We are not yet foes, and we rejoice that you are alive beyond our hope. We came expecting to find none living here, yet now that we are met there is a matter for parley and a council. Who are you, and of what would you parley? I am Bard, and by my hand was the dragon slain and your treasure delivered. Is that not a matter that concerns you? Moreover, I am by right descent the heir of Girion of Dale, and in your hoard is mingled much of the wealth of his halls and towns, which old Smaug stole. Is that not a matter of which we may speak? Further, in his last battle, Smaug destroyed the dwellings of the men of Esgaroth, and I am yet the servant of their master. I would speak for him, and ask whether you have no thought for the sorrow and misery of his people. They aided you in your distress, and in recompense you have thus far brought ruin only, though doubtless undesigned." Now these were fair words and true, if proudly and grimly spoken, and Bilbo thought that Thorin would at once admit what justice was in them. He did not, of course, expect that anyone would remember what it was who had discovered all by himself the dragon's weak spot, and that was just as well, for no one ever did. But also he did not reckon with the power that gold has upon which a dragon has long brooded, nor with dwarfish hearts. Long hours in the past days Thorin had spent in the treasury, and the lust of it was heavy on him. Though he had hunted chiefly for the Arkenstone, yet he had an eye for many another wonderful thing that was lying there, about which were wound old memories of the labors and the sorrows of his race. "You put your worst cost last, and in chief place," Thorin answered. "To the treasure of my people no man has a claim, because Smaug, who stole it from us, also robbed him of life or home. The treasure was not his, that evil deeds should be amended with a share of it. The price of the goods and the assistance that we received of the lakemen we will fairly pay in due time, but nothing will we give, not even a loaf's worth, under threat of force. When an armed host lies before our doors, we look on you as foes and thieves. It is in my mind to ask what share of their inheritance you'd have paid to our kindred had you found the hoard unguarded and us slain." "A just question," replied Bard, "but you are not dead, and we are not robbers. Moreover, the wealthy may have pity beyond right on the needy that befriended them when they were in want, and still my other claims remain unanswered. I will not parley, as I have said, with armed men at my gate, nor at all with the people of the Elven King, whom I remember with small kindness. In this debate they have no place. Begone now ere our arrows fly. And if you would speak with me again, first dismiss the elvish host to the woods where it belongs, and then return, laying down your arms as you approach the threshold." So he's basically here saying that they have no right to the treasure just because Smaug destroyed their town, which I think is silly, especially the fact that Bard was the one that killed the dragon. And moreover, he's saying that, because you brought weapons, that means that you're a foe, which is interesting. And you do have to wonder a little bit why they came so heavily armed when they thought Thorin and everybody else was dead, and that there were only 13 of them. But I think that it's obvious why when you stop to think about the birds flying everywhere, and that the news of the treasure being up for grabs had even reached the goblins, which is, of course, going to come into play very soon. Okay. "The Elven King is my friend, and he has succored the people of the lake in their need, though they have no claim but friendship on him," answered Bard. "We will give you time to repent your words. Gather your wisdom ere we return."
Then he departed and went back to the camp. Ere many hours were past, the banner-bearers returned, and trumpeters stood forth and blew a blast. "In the name of Esgaroth and the forest," one cried, "we speak unto Thorin Thrain's son Oakenshield, calling himself the king under the mountain, and we bid him consider well the claims that have been urged, or be declared our foe. At the least he shall deliver 1/12 portion of the treasure unto Bard as the dragon slayer, and as the heir of Girion. From that portion Bard will himself contribute to the aid of Esgaroth, but if Thorin would have the friendship and honour of their lands about, as his sires had of old, then he will give also somewhat of his own for the comfort of the men of the lake." Then Thorin seized a bow of horn, and shot an arrow at the speaker. It smote into his shield, and stuck there, quivering. "Since such is your answer," he called in return, "I declare the mountain besieged. You shall not depart from it until you call on our side a truce and a parley. We will bear no weapons against you, but we will leave you to your gold. You may eat that, if you will." With that the messengers departed swiftly, and the dwarves were left to consider their case. So grim had Thorin become that even if they had wished, the others would not have dared to find fault with him, and indeed most of them seemed to share his mind, except perhaps old fat Bombur and Filian Killy. Bilbo, of course, disapproved of the whole turn of affairs. He had now had more than enough of the mountain, and being besieged inside it was not at all to his taste. "This whole place still stinks of dragon," he grumbled to himself, "and it makes me sick, and cram is beginning to simply stick in my throat." I had an apple soda once, and I thought it was disgusting, so I understand what you're talking about. It was like a Taco Bell or something. All right, Chapter 16, A Thief in the Night. We're going to try and get through this quicker. I'll take less pauses. We only have a few more chapters, and they are shorter, but I don't want to go too late here, but we want to finish. Now the days passed slowly and warily. Many of the dwarves spent their time piling and ordering the treasure, and now Thorin spoke of the Arkenstone of Thrain, and bade them eagerly to look for it in every corner. "For the Arkenstone of my father," he said, "is worth more than a river of gold in itself, and to me is beyond price. That stone of all the treasure I name unto myself, and will be avenged on anyone who finds it and withholds it." Note there, I said I'd pause last, but it's very similar to Feanor's Oath. The Arkenstone's not a Silmaril, as I went over earlier, but it's very similar. "I will revenge myself upon anyone who holds it." Very similar to the Oath of Feanor. Bilbo heard these words, and he grew afraid, wondering what would happen if the stone was found, wrapped in an old bundle of tattered oddments that he used as a pillow. All the same, he did not speak of it, for as the weariness of the days grew heavier, the beginnings of a plan had come into his little head. Things had gone on like this for some time, when the ravens brought news that Dane and more than 500 dwarves, hurrying from the Iron Hills, were now within about 2 days' march of Dale, coming from the northeast. "But they cannot reach the mountain unmarked," said Roak, "and I fear less there be battle in the valley. I do not call this counsel good. Though they are a grim folk, they are not likely to overcome the host that besets you. And even if they did so, what will you gain? Winter and snow is hastening behind them. How shall you be fed without friendship and goodwill of the lands about you? The treasure is likely to be your death, though the dragon is no more." But Thorin was not moved. "Winter and snow will bite both men and elves," he said, "and they may find their dwelling in the waste grievous to bear. With my friends behind them and winter upon them, they will perhaps be in a softer mood to parley with." That night Bilbo made up his mind. The sky was black and moonless. As soon as it was full dark, he went to a corner of an inner chamber just within the gate and drew from his bundling a rope, but also the Arkenstone wrapped in a rag. Then he climbed to the top of the wall. Only Bombur was there, for it was his turn to watch, and the dwarves kept only one watchman at a time. "It is mighty cold," said Bombur. "I wish we could have a fire up here, as they have in the camp." "It is warm enough inside," said Bilbo. "I dare say, but I am bound here till midnight," grumbled the fat dwarf. "A sorry business altogether. Not that I venture to disagree with Thorin, may his beard grow ever longer. Yet he was ever a dwarf with a stiff neck." "Not as stiff as my legs," said Bilbo. "I am tired of stairs and stone passages. I would give a good deal for the feel of grass at my toes." "I would give a good deal for the feel of a strong drink in my throat, and for a soft bed after a good supper. I can't give you those while the siege is going on, but it is long since I watched, and I will take your turn for you if you like. There is no sleep in me tonight." "You're a good fellow, Mr. Baggins. I will take your offer kindly. If there should be anything to note, rouse me first, mind you. I will lie in the inner chamber to the left, not far away." "Off you go," said Bilbo. "I will wake you at midnight, and you can wake the next watchman." Yes, I would agree with that. I think the rings were worse in a way, but more concentrated in specific people, not so much just in general. As soon as Bomber had gone, Bilbo put on his ring, fastened his rope, slipped down over the wall, and was gone. He had about 5 hours before him. Bomber would sleep, he could sleep at any time, and ever since the adventure in the forest, he was always trying to recapture the beautiful dreams he had then. And all the others were busy with Thorin. It was unlikely that any, even Philly or Killy, would come out on the wall until it was their turn. It was very dark, and the road, after a while, when he left the newly made path and climbed down toward the lower course of the stream, was strange to him. At last he came to the bend where he had to cross the water, if he was able to make for the camp, as he wished. The bed of the stream was there shallow, but already broad, and fording it in the dark was not easy for the little hobbit. He was nearly across when he missed his footing on a round stone and fell into the cold water with a splash. He had barely scrambled up on the far bank, shivering and spluttering, when up came elves in the gloom with bright lanterns and searched for the cause of the noise. "That was no fish," one said. "There is a spy about. Hide your lights. They will help him more than us if it is that queer little creature that is said to be their servant." "Servant, indeed," snorted Bilbo. In the middle of his snort he sneezed loudly, and the elves immediately gathered towards the sound. "Let's have a light," he said. "I am here if you want me." And he slipped off his ring and popped from behind a rock. They seized him quickly in spite of their surprise. "Who are you? Are you the dwarves' hobbit? What are you doing? How did you get so far past our sentinels?" they asked one after the other. "I am Mr. Bilbo Baggins," he asked, "companion of Thorin, if you want to know. I know your king well by sight, though perhaps he doesn't know me to look at. But Bard will remember me, and it is Bard I particularly want to see." "Indeed," said they. "And what may be your business?" "Whatever it is, it's my own, my good elves. But if you ever wish to get back to your own woods from this cold, cheerless place," he answered, shivering, "you will take me along quick to a fire where I can dry, and then you will let me speak to your chiefs as quick as may be. I have only an hour or two to spare." That is how it came about that some 2 hours after his escape from the gate, Bilbo was sitting beside a warm fire in front of a large tent. And there sat two, gazing curiously at him, both the Elven King and Bard. A hobbit in elvish armor, partly wrapped in an old blanket, was something new to them. "Really, you know," Bilbo was saying in his best business manner, "things are impossible. Personally, I'm tired of the whole affair. I wish I was back in the West with my own home, where folk are more reasonable. But I have an interest in this matter, 1/14 share to be precise, according to a letter, which fortunately I believe I have kept." He drew from a pocket in his old jacket, which he still wore over his mail, crumpled and much folded Thorin's letter that had been put under the clock on his mantelpiece in May. "A share of the profits, mind you," he went on. "I am aware of that. Personally, I am only too ready to consider all your claims carefully, and deduct what is right from the total before putting in my own claim. However, you don't know Thorin Oakenshield as well as I do now. I assure you he is quite ready to sit on a heap of gold and starve, as long as you sit here." "Well, let him," said Bard. "Such a fool deserves to starve." "Quite so," said Bilbo. "I see your point of view. At the same time, winter is coming on fast. Before long you will be having snow and what-not, and supplies will be difficult, even for elves, I imagine. And also there'll be other difficulties. You have not heard of Dane and the dwarves of the Iron Hills?" "We have, a long time ago, but what has he got to do with us?" asked the king. "I thought as much. I see I have some information you have not got. Dane, I may tell you, is now less than 2 days' march off, and has at least 500 grim dwarves with him. A good many of them had experience in the dreadful dwarf and goblin wars, of which you have no doubt heard. When they arrive, there may be serious trouble." "Why do you tell us this? Are you betraying your friends, or are you threatening us?" asked Bard grimly. "My dear Bard," squeaked Bilbo, "do not be hasty. I never met with such suspicious folk. I'm merely trying to avoid trouble for all concerned. Now I will make you an offer." "Let us hear it," they said. "You may see it," said he. "It is this." And he drew forth the Arkenstone and threw away the wrapping. The Elven King himself, whose eyes were used to things of wonder and beauty, stood up in amazement. Even Bard gazed marveling at it in silence. It was as if a globe had been filled with moonlight and hung before them in a net woven in the glint of frosty stars. "This is the Arkenstone of Thrain," said Bilbo, "the heart of the mountain, and it is also the heart of Thorin Oakenshield. He values it above a river of gold. I give it to you. It will aid you in your bargaining." Then Bilbo, not without a shudder, not without a glance of longing, handed the marvelous stone to Bard, and he held it in his hand, as though dazed. "But how is it yours to give?" he asked at last with effort. "Oh, well," said the hobbit uncomfortably. "It isn't exactly, but, well, I'm willing to let it stand against all my claim, don't you know? I may be a burglar, or so they say. Personally, I never really felt like one. But I'm an honest one, I hope, more or less. Anyway, I'm going back now, and the dwarves can do what they like to me. I hope you will find it useful." The Elven King looked at Bilbo with a new wonder. "Bilbo Baggins," he said, "you are more worthy to wear the armor of elf princes than many that have looked more comely in it. But I wonder if Thorin Oakenshield will see it so. I have more knowledge of dwarves in general than you have, perhaps. I advise you to remain with us, and here you shall be honored and thrice welcome." "Thank you very much, I am sure," said Bilbo with a bow. "But I don't think I ought to leave my friends like this, after all we've gone through together. And really, I promised to wake old Bombur at midnight, too. Really, I must be going in quickly." Nothing they could say would stop him, so an escort was provided for him as he went back. Both the king and bard saluted him with honor. As they passed through the camp, an old man wrapped in a dark cloak rose from a tent door where he was sitting and came toward them. "Well done, Mr. Baggins," he said, clapping Bilbo on the back. "There is always more about you than anyone expects." It was Gandalf. For the first time for many a day, Bilbo was really delighted, but there was no time for all the questions that he immediately wished to ask. "All in good time," said Gandalf. "Things are drawing toward the end now, unless I am mistaken. There is an unpleasant time just in front of you, but keep your heart up. You may come through all right. There is news brewing that even the ravens have not heard. Good night." Puzzled but cheered, Bilbo hurried on. He was guided for a safe ford and set across dry, and he said farewell to the elves and climbed back carefully toward the gate. Great weariness began to come over him, but it was well before midnight when he clambered up the rope again. It was still where he had left it. He untied it and hid it, and then he went down the wall and wondered anxiously what would happen next. At midnight he woke up Bombur, and then in turn rolled himself up in the corner without listening to the old dwarf's thanks, which he felt he had hardly earned. He was soon fast asleep, forgetting all the worries till morning. As a matter of fact, he was dreaming of eggs and bacon. Okay. Hobbits in the dark. Yeah, I'm sorry about the ads. The ads are, they do support me. You can subscribe to the channel. You'll never get ads in that sense. But yeah. If you ever are in an ad break on Twitch and you need to be able to hear me, what you could do is you could pop out the mini player that shows me while the ads are playing, and then it will become its own player and you could raise the volume. Like I said, the ads are how I support myself here. So I don't have a lot to say about this. He gives them the Arkenstone, and you can see that, you know, between him and Thranduil and Bard and Gandalf, there's a whole lot of honesty going on. Even Bard is like, but is this even really yours to give? Bilbo's sort of playing both sides against each other, trying to avoid a very bloody conflict. So let's move on to the next chapter here. Chapter 17, The Clouds Burst. So there's only 2 more chapters after this, and they're rather short ones. So we're going to finish this tonight. Even though we're about 20 minutes away from when I normally end streams, we're in it for the long haul till we finish. Next day, the trumpets rang early in the camp. Soon a single runner was seen hurrying along the narrow path. At a distance he stood and hailed them, asking whether Thorin would now listen to another embassy, since new tidings had come to hand and matters were changed. "That will be Dane," said Thorin when he heard. "They will have got wind of his coming. I thought that would also alter their mood. Bid them come in few in number and weaponless, and I will hear," he called to the messenger. About midday the banners of the forest and the lake were seen to be borne forth again. A company of 20 was approaching. At the beginning of the narrow way they laid aside sword and spear, and came on towards the gate. Wondering, the dwarves saw that among them were both Bard and the Elven King, before whom an old man wrapped in cloak and hood bore a strong casket of iron-bound wood. "Hail, Thorin," said Bard. "Are you still of the same mind?" "My mind does not change with the rising and setting of a few suns," answered Thorin. "Did you come to ask me idle questions? Still the elf host has not departed as I bade. Till then you come in vain to bargain with me. Is there nothing for which you would yield any of your gold? Nothing that you or your friends have to offer? What of the Arkenstone of Thrain?" said he. And at the same moment the old man opened the casket and held aloft the jewel. The light leapt from his hand, bright and white in the morning. Then Thorin was stricken dumb with amazement and confusion. No one spoke for a long time. Thorin at length broke the silence, and his voice was thick with wrath. "That stone was my father's and is mine," he said. "Why should I purchase my own?" But a wonder overcame him, and he added, "But how came you to the heirloom of my house, if there is need to ask such a question of thieves?" "We are not thieves," Bard answered. "Your own we will give back in return for our own." How came you by it? Shouted Thorin in gathering rage. I gave it to them, squeaked Bilbo, who was peeping over the wall, now in dreadful fright. You! Cried Thorin, turning upon him and grasping him with both hands. You miserable hobbit! You undersized burglar! He shouted at a loss for words, and he shook poor Bilbo like a rabbit. By the beard of Durin! I wish I had Gandalf here. Curse him for his choice of you. May his beard wither. As for you, I will throw you to the rocks, he cried, and lifted Bilbo in his arms. Stay! Your wish is granted, said a voice. The old man with the casket threw aside his hood and cloak. Here is Gandalf, and none too soon it seems. If you don't like my burglar, please don't damage him. Put him down, and listen first to what he has to say. You all seem to be in league, said Thorin, dropping Bilbo at the top of the wall. Never again will I have dealings with any wizards or his friends. What have you to say, you descendant of rats? Dear me, said Bilbo. I'm sure this is all very uncomfortable. You may remember saying that I might choose my own 14th share. Perhaps I took it too literally. I had been told that dwarves were sometimes politer in word than in deed. This time was all the same when you seemed to think that I had been of some service. Descendant of rats, indeed. Is this all the service you and your family that I was promised, Thorin? Take that I have disposed of my share as I wished, and let it go at that. I will, said Thorin grimly. And I will let you go at that, and may we never meet again. Then he turned and spoke over the wall. I am betrayed, he said. It was rightly guessed that I could not forbear to redeem the Arkenstone, the treasure of my home. For it I will give 1/14th share of the hoard in silver and gold, setting aside the gems, but that shall be accounted the promised share of this traitor, and with the reward he shall depart, and you can divide it as you will. He will get little enough, I doubt not. Take him if you wish him to live, and no friendship of mine goes with him. Get down now to your friends, he said to Bilbo, or I will throw you down. What about the gold and the silver? Asked Bilbo. That shall follow after as can be arranged, said he. Get down. Until then we keep the stone, cried Bard. You are not making a very splendid figure as king under the mountains, said Gandalf, but things may change yet. They may indeed, said Thorin, and already so strong was the bewilderment of the treasure upon him that he was pondering whether by help of Dane he might not recapture the Arkenstone and withhold the share of the reward. And so Bilbo was swung down from the wall and departed with nothing for all his trouble except the armor which Thorin had given him already. More than one of the dwarves in their hearts felt shame and pity at his going. Farewell, he cried to them. We may meet again as friends. Be off, said Thorin. You have mail upon you, which was made by my folk. It is too good for you. It cannot be pierced by arrows, but if you do not hasten, I will sting your miserable feet. So be swift. Not so hasty, said Bard. We will give you until tomorrow. At noon we will return, and see if you have brought from the hoard the portion that is to be set against the stone. If that is done without deceit, then we will depart, and the elf host will go back to the forest. In the meanwhile, farewell. With that they went back to the camp, but Thorin sent messengers by Roak, telling Dane of what had passed, and bidding him come with wary speed. That day passed into the night. The next day the wind shifted west, and the air was dark and gloomy. The morning was still early when a cry was heard in the camp. Runners came in to report that a host of dwarves had appeared round the eastern spur of the mountain, and was now hastening to Dale. Dane had come. He had hurried on through the night, and so had come upon them sooner than they had expected. Each one of his folks was clad in a hauberk of steel mail that hung to his knees, and his legs were covered with a hose of fine and flexible metal mesh, the secret of whose making was possessed by Dane's people. The dwarves were exceedingly strong for their height, but most of these were strong even for dwarves. In battle they wielded heavy, two-handed mattocks, but each of them had also a short broadsword at his side, and a round shield slung at his back. Their beards were forked and plaited and thrust into their belts. Their caps were of iron, and they were shod with iron, and their faces were grim. Trumpets called men and elves to arms. Before long the dwarves could be seen coming up the valley at a great pace. They halted between the river and the eastern spur, but in a few held on their way, and crossing the river drew near the camp. And there they laid down their weapons and held up their hands in signs of peace. Bard went out to meet them, and with them went Bilbo. We are sent from Dane, son of Nain, they said, when questioned. We are hastening to our kinsmen in the mountains, since we learn the kingdom of old is renewed. But who are you that sit in this plain as foes before these defended walls? This, of course, in the polite and rather old-fashioned language of such occasions, meant simply, you have no business here, we are going on, so make way, or we shall fight you. They meant to push on before the mountain and the loop of the river, for the narrow land there did not seem to be strongly guarded. Bard, of course, refused to allow the dwarves to go straight on to the mountain. He was determined to wait until the gold and silver had been brought out in exchange for the Arkenstone, for he did not believe that this would be done if once the fortress was manned with so large and warlike a company. They had brought with them a great store of supplies, for the dwarves can carry very heavy burdens, and nearly all of Dane's folk, in spite of their rapid march, bore huge packs on their backs in addition to their weapons. They would stand at siege for weeks, and by that time yet more dwarves may come, and yet more, for Thorin had many relatives. Also, they would be able to reopen and guard some other gate, so that besiegers would have to encircle the whole mountain, and for that they had not sufficient numbers. These were in fact precisely their plans, for the raven messengers had been busy between Thorin and Dane. But for the moment the way was barred, so after angry words the dwarf messengers retired, muttering in their beards. Bard then sent messengers at once to the gate, but they found no gold or payment. Arrows came forth as soon as they were within shot, and they hastened back in dismay. In the camp all was now astir as if for battle, for the dwarves of Dane were advancing long upon the eastern banks. Fools, laughed Bard, to come thus beneath the mountain's arm? They do not understand war above ground, whether they know of battle in the mines. There are many of our archers and spearmen now hidden in the rocks upon the right flank. Dwarf mail may be good, but they will soon be hard put to it. Let us set on them now from both sides, before they are fully rested. But the Elven King said, Long will I tarry ere I begin this war for gold. The dwarves cannot pass us unless we will, or do anything we cannot mark. Let us hope still that something that will bring us reconciliation, our advantage in numbers, will be enough in the end. It must come to unhappy blows. So to pause here and comment, one of the greatest bits of character assassination that happened in the film versions of Tolkien's work, obviously Faramir was a pretty bad one, but in The Hobbit, certainly Thranduil was just absolutely slaughtered as a character. They made him into such an unreasonable character. And here you can even see, wait, hold on. I would really not rather go to war. Let's see if we can come to some sort of peaceful agreement. It's hard to imagine the character as played by Lee Pace. Not that I'm blaming Lee Pace for the way that it was adapted, but it's hard to imagine that version of the character coming to this sort of conclusion here. But he reckoned without the dwarves. The knowledge that the Arkenstone was in the hands of the besiegers burned in their thoughts. Also they guessed the hesitation of Bard and his friends, and resolved to strike while they debated. Suddenly, without a signal, they sprang silently forward to attack. Bows twanged and arrows whistled. Battle was about to be joined. Still more suddenly a darkness came on with dreadful swiftness. A black cloud hurried over the sky. Winter thunder on a wild wind rolled roaring up and rumbled in the mountains, and lightning lit its peak. And beneath the thunder another blackness could be seen whirling forward, but it did not come with the wind. It came from the north, like a vast cloud of birds, so dense that no light could be seen between their wings. "Halt!" cried Gandalf, who appeared suddenly, and stood alone with arms uplifted between the advancing dwarves and the ranks awaiting them. "Halt!" he cried in a voice like thunder, and his staff blazed forth with a flash like lightning. "Dread has come to you all. Alas, it has come more swiftly than I guessed. The goblins are upon you. Bolg of the North is coming, O Dane, whose father you slew in Moria. Behold, the bats are above his army like a sea of locusts. They ride upon wolves, and wargs are in their train." Amazement and confusion fell upon them all. Even as Gandalf had been speaking, the darkness grew. The dwarves halted and gazed at the sky. The elves cried out with many voices. "Come!" cried Gandalf. "There is yet time for counsel. Let Dane, son of Nain, come swiftly to us." Yes, I was actually going to point that out. Machismo. He used a lot of alliteration in that. We had wild wind, and then roaring up and rumbled, and then lightning lit. There was a lot of alliterative work in there. Tolkien clearly likes that. There is a footnote about Bolg that he's the son of Azog, and to see page 33, Azog was a very nasty dwarf who took over a portion of Moria. There was a battle called the Battle of Anuzalbar, where Dane slew Azog, who had slain Thror, and he had not only had he slain Thror, but he carved his name Azog into Thror's head and threw the head out to Thrain and Dane, along with a few coins, calling them beggars. So Azog was quite a nasty creature. He's dead. His son Bolg is now the leader of the orcs. And also notice that these orcs, they can't really travel during the day. But what they're doing here is rather similar to what Sauron would do for his forces, which included goblins and trolls in the Return of the King, that he sent a black pallor, smoke from Mount Doom to blanket Gondor and make it dark for several days. And it wound up breaking sooner than he had expected, and that kind of ruined his plans there. But here what they have is they have a swirling mist of bats. And this is certainly an example of what Tolkien would refer to as goblin magic, because the goblins do have magic. People ask about this sometimes. Men have magic, elves have magic, hobbits even have a form of magic, as was explained in this book. Dwarves have magic, and goblins have magic, and this is an example of it that we can see there, the control of the bats that is blotting out the light so that they could fight. So began a battle that none had expected, and it was called the Battle of Five Armies, and it was very terrible. Upon one side were the goblins and the wild wolves, and upon the other were elves and men and dwarves. This is how it fell out. Ever since the fall of the great goblin of the Misty Mountains, the hatred of their race for the dwarves had been rekindled to fury. Messengers had passed to and fro between all their circles, colonies, and strongholds, for they resolved now to win the dominion of the north. Tidings they had gathered in secret ways. In all the mountains there was a forging and an arming. There they marched and gathered by hill and valley, going ever by tunnel or under dark, until around and beneath the great mountain Gundabad of the north, where was their capital, a vast host was assembled, ready to sweep down in time of storm unawares upon the south. There they learned of the death of Smaug, and joy was in their hearts, and they hastened night after night through the mountain, and came thus at last on a sudden from the north hard on the heels of Dane, not since the ravens knew of their coming, until they came about in the broken lands which divided the lonely mountain from the hills behind. How much Gandalf knew cannot be said, but it is plain that he had not expected the sudden assault. This is the plan that he made in council with the Elven King, and with Bard, and with Dane, for the Dwarf Lord now joined them. The goblins were the foes of all, and at their coming all other quarrels were forgotten. Their only hope was to lure the goblins into the valley between the arms of the mountains, and themselves to man the great spurs that struck south and east. Yet this would be perilous if the goblins were in sufficient numbers to overrun the mountain itself, and so attack from also behind and above. But there was no time to make any other plan, or to summon any help. Soon the thunder passed, rolling away to the southeast, but the bat cloud came, flying lower over the shoulder of the mountains, and whirled above them, shutting out the light and filling them with dread. "To the mountain!" cried Bard. "To the mountain! Let us take our places while there is yet time." On the southern spur, in its lower slopes, and in the rocks at its feet, the elves were set, and the eastern spur were men and dwarves. But Bard and some of the nimblest of men and elves climbed to the height of the eastern shoulder to gain a view of the north. Soon they can see the lands before the mountain's feet, black with a hurrying multitude. Ere long the vanguard swirled round the spur's end and came rushing into Dale. There were the swiftest wolf riders, and already their cries and howls rent the air afar. A few brave men were strung before them to make a feint of resistance, and many there fell before the rest drew back and fled to either side. As Gandalf had hoped, the goblin army had gathered behind the resisted vanguard, and poured now in rage into the valley, driving wildly up between the arms of the mountain, seeking wildly up between the arms of the mountain, seeking their foe. Sorry about that. Their banners were countless, black and red, and they came on like a tide in fury and disorder. It was a terrible battle, the most dreadful of all Bilbo's experiences, and the one at which time he hated the most, which is to say, it is the one that he was the most proud of, and the most fond of recalling long afterwards, although he was quite unimportant in it. Actually, I may say he put on his ring early in the business, and vanished from sight, if not from all danger. A magic ring of that sort is not a complete protection in a goblin charge, nor does it stop flying arrows and wild spears. But it does help in getting out of the way, and it prevents your head from being especially chosen for a sweeping stroke by a goblin swordsman. The elves were the first to charge. Their hatred for the goblins is cold and bitter. Their spears and swords shone in the gloom with a gleam of chill flame. So deadly was the wrath of the hands that held them. As soon as the host of their enemies was dense in the valley, they sent against it a shower of arrows, and each flickered as it fled, as if with stinging fire. Behind the arrows, 1,000 of their spearmen leaped down in charge. The yells were deafening. The rocks were stained black with goblin blood. Just as the goblins were recovering from the onslaught and the elf charge was halted, there arose from across the valley a deep-throated roar, with cries of Moria and Dane, Dane. The dwarves of the Iron Hills plunged in, wielding their mattocks upon either side, and beside them came the men of the lake with long swords. Panic came upon the goblins, and even then they turned to meet this new attack. The elves charged again with renewed numbers. Already many of the goblins were flying back down the river to escape from the trap, and many of their own wolves were turning back upon them and rending the dead and the wounded. Victory seemed at hand when a cry rang out on the heights above. Goblins had scaled the mountain from the other side, and already more were on the slopes above the gate, and others were streaming down recklessly, heedless of those that fell screaming from the cliff and precipice to attack the spurs from above. Each of these could be reached by paths that ran down from the main mass of the mountain in the center, and the defenders had too few to bar the way for long. Victory now vanished from hope. They had only stemmed the first onslaught of the black tide. Day drew on. The goblins gathered again in the valley. There a host of wargs came ravening. With them came the bodyguard of Bolg, goblin of huge side with scimitars of steel. Soon actual darkness was coming into a stormy sky, while still the great bats swirled about their heads and ears of elves and men, or fastened, vampire-like, on the stricken. Now Bard was fighting to defend the eastern spur, and yet giving back slowly, and the elf lords were at bay upon their king, upon the southern arm, near to the watch-post on Ravenhill. Suddenly there was a great shout, and from the gate came a trumpet call. They had forgotten Thorin. Part of the wall, moved by levers, fell outward with a crash into the pool. Out leapt the king under the mountain, and his companions followed him. Hood and cloak were gone. They were in shining armor, and red light leapt from their eyes. In the gloom, the great dwarf gleamed like gold in a dying fire. Rocks were hurled down from on high by the goblins above, but they held on, leaped to their fall's foot, and rushed forward to battle. Wolf and rider fled or fell before them. Thorin wielded his axe with mighty strokes, and nothing seemed to hurt him. To me, elves and men, to me! O my kinsfolk!" he cried, and his voice shook like a horn in the valley. Down, heedless of order, rushed all the dwarves of Dane to his help. Down, too, came many of the lakemen, for Bard could not restrain them. And out upon the other side came many of the spearmen of the elves. Once again the goblins were stricken in the valley, and they were piled in heaps till Dale was dark and hideous with their corpses. The wargs were scattered, and Thorin drove right against the bodyguard of Bolg, but he could not pierce their ranks. Already behind him, among the goblin dead, lay many men and many dwarves, and many a fair elf that should have lived yet long ages merrily in the wood. And as the valley widened, his onset grew ever slower. His numbers were too few. His flanks were unguarded. Soon the attackers were attacked, and they were forced into a great ring, facing every way, hemmed all about with goblins and wolves, returning to the assault. The bodyguard of Bolg came howling against them, and drove in upon their ranks like waves upon cliffs of sand. Their friends could not help them, for the assaults from the mountains were renewed with redoubled force, and upon either side men and elves were being slowly beaten down. On all this Bilbo looked with misery. He had taken his stand on Ravenhill among the elves, partly because there was more of a chance of escape from that point, and partly, with a more tookish part of his mind, because if he was going to be of a last desperate stand, he preferred, on the whole, to defend the Elven King. Gandalf, too, I may say, was there, sitting on the ground as if in deep thought, preparing, I suppose, for some last blast of magic before the end. That did not seem far off. It will not be long now, thought Bilbo, before the goblins win the gate, and we are all slaughtered or driven down and captured. Really, it is enough to make one weep, after all one has gone through. I would rather old Smaug had been left with all the wretched treasure than all these vile creatures should get it, and poor old Bombur and Balin and Fili and Kili and all the rest come to a bad end, and Bard too, and the lake men and the merry elves. Misery me! I have heard of songs of many battles, and I have always understood that defeat may be glorious. It seems very uncomfortable, not to say distressing. I wish I was well out of it." The clouds were torn by the wind, and a red sunset slashed the west. Seeing the sudden gleam in the gloom, Bilbo looked around. He gave a great cry, and he had a sight that made his heart leap. Dark shapes, small yet majestic, among the distant glow. "The eagles! The eagles!" he shouted. "The eagles are coming!" Bilbo's eyes were seldom wrong. The eagles were coming down the wind, line after line, in such a host as must have gathered from all the eyries in the north. "The eagles! The eagles!" Bilbo cried, dancing and waving in his arms. If the elves could not see him, they could hear him. Soon they took to the cry, and it echoed across the valley. Many wandering eyes looked up, though as yet nothing could be seen except from the southern shoulders of the mountain. "The eagles!" cried Bilbo once more, but at that moment a stone hurtling from above smote heavily upon his helm, and he fell with a crash and knew no more. And that's that chapter. I do have to take a very brief break here to take a drink. The bats being the descendants of vampires is interesting. Tolkien's vampires are not very well fleshed out. We know they were bat-like. We know Sauron could turn into a vampire. We know that the only named vampire was a vampire woman named Thorinwithil, which was Sauron's messenger, and that they could fly. I think these are just bats, because I think that if they were meant to be the descendants of vampires, much the way that wargs are seen as being the descendants of werewolves, I think that we would understand them as an entirely separate force. It would be another army in the Battle of Five Armies. I really think that they're just bats that are controlled by goblin magic. There didn't seem to be enough vampires for there to be vast clouds of their descendants in the Third Age, because they're so seldom spoken about. Okay. Chapter 18, The Return Journey. When Bilbo came to himself, he was literally by himself. He was lying on the flat stones of Ravenhill, and no one was near. A cloudless day, but cold, was broad above him. He was shaking, and as chilled as stone, but his head burned with fire. "Now I wonder what has happened," he said to himself. "At any rate, I am not yet of the fallen heroes, but I suppose there is still time enough for that." He sat up painfully. Looking into the valley, he could see no living goblins. After a while, as his head cleared a little, he thought he could see the elves moving in the rocks below. He rubbed his eyes. Surely there was a camp still in the plain some distance off, and there was a coming and going about the gate. Dwarves seemed to be busy removing the wall. But all was deadly still. There was no call and no echo of a song. Sorrow seemed to be in the air. "Victory after all, I suppose," he said, feeling his aching head. "Well, it seems a very gloomy business." Suddenly he was aware of a man climbing up and coming towards him. "Hello there," he called with a shaky voice. "Hello there, what news?" "What voice is it that speaks among the stones?" said the man, halting and peering about him not far from where Bilbo sat. Then Bilbo remembered his ring. "Well, I'm blessed," he said. "His invisibility has its drawbacks after all. Otherwise, I suppose I might have spent a warm and comfortable night in bed. It's me, Bilbo Baggins, companion of Thorin," he cried, hurriedly taking off the ring. "It is well that I have found you," said the man, striding forward. "You are needed, and we have looked for you long. You would have numbered among the dead, who were many, if Gandalf the Wizard had not said that your voice was last heard in this place. I have been sent to look here for the last time. Are you much hurt?" "A nasty knock on the head, I think," said Bilbo. "But I have a helm and a hard skull. All the same, I feel sick, and my legs are like straws." "I will carry you down to the camp in the valley," said the man, and picked him lightly up. The man was swift and sure-footed. It was not long before Bilbo was sat down before a tent in Dale, and there stood Gandalf with his arm in a sling. Even the wizard had not escaped without a wound, and there were many unharmed in all the host. When Gandalf saw Bilbo, he was delighted. "Baggins!" he exclaimed. "Well, I never. Alive after all. I am glad. I began to wonder if even your luck would see you through. A terrible business, and it was disastrous. But other news can wait. Come," he said more gravely. "You are called for." And leading the hobbit, he took him within the tent. "Hail Thorin," he said as he entered. "I have brought him." There indeed lay Thorin Oakenshield, wounded with many wounds, and his rent armor and notched axe were cast upon the floor. He looked up at Bilbo, as Bilbo came up beside him. "Farewell, good thief," he said. "I go now to the halls of waiting to sit beside my fathers, until the world is renewed. Since I leave now all gold and silver, and go where it is of little worth, I wish to part in friendship with you, and I would take back my words and deeds at the gate." Bilbo knelt on one knee, filled with sorrow. "Farewell, King under the mountain," he said. "This is a bitter adventure if it must end so, and not a mountain of gold can amend it. Yet I am glad that I have shared in your perils. That has been more than any Baggins deserves." "No," said Thorin. "There is more in you of good than you know, child of the kindly West. Some courage and some wisdom blended in measure. If more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world. But sad or merry, I must leave it now. Farewell." So to pause there, there's Tolkien's philosophy right there in Thorin's dying words. If more people valued food and song and cheer above money, the world would be a better place. The other thing to point out here is he said that he's going to the halls of waiting. He's talking about a place called Mandos. Mandos is a real physical location, a cavernous part of the Undying Lands. And that is where souls go when somebody's body has died. If the soul is of a mortal man, they will depart from the world through a path that only the Doomkeeper of Mandos, whose name is Namo, but the elves usually just call him Mandos, only he knows about this path, and it goes to a location, an afterlife, that only Iluvatar, God, knows about. Elves, if they are slain, go there as well, but they can't depart from the world like men can. And there's also another bit to the whole part about mortals, is that if a mortal is slain before their allotted time, the time that they have in the world as appointed by God, before that's up, they have to wait for their time to be up, and they wait in Mandos. And that's why it's called the Halls of Awaiting. But the dwarves don't have an afterlife. The men have an afterlife. And the elves don't die. Elves don't die at all. They are given new bodies, and they go back to their body, and they live again. They are reincarnated. Unless Namo decides that they've been bad, and he can keep them there. And the power of Namo is one of the most mysterious and the greatest in all of the world, because even Manwë, or even Melkor, the greatest and most powerful of all the Valar, could not leave Mandos without Namo's permission. So, yeah, that's a big one. And this is the dwarves, though. They don't have an afterlife because they're not children of Iluvatar. God didn't create them. They were created by Aula. And they have to wait in Mandos for the end of the world. That's a long bit of waiting. But Thorin is just sort of at peace with it in this moment. He's saying he's going to get to be with his forebears. He's going to meet all of his ancestors, and he's going to be with them. And they're going to wait till the end of the world. And then what happens? Supposedly they get an afterlife at that point. And all of the men that have ever died come together and sing with the angels to remake the world without evil. What we don't know is what happened to elves at the end of the world. They might just die at that point. Tolkien was never clear about that. But I wanted to talk about that, the Halls of Waiting, showing that the dwarves go to Mandos, or at least they believe they do, although Tolkien never said anything otherwise. He never said anything that would contradict what Thorin was saying here. Then Bilbo turned away, and he went by himself and sat alone, wrapped in a blanket. And whether you believe it or not, he wept until his eyes were red and his voice was hoarse. He was a kindly little soul. Indeed, it was long before he had the heart to make a joke again. A mercy it is, he said to himself at last, that I woke up when I did. I wish Thorin were living, but I am glad that we parted in kindness. You're a fool, Bilbo Baggins, and you make a great mess of that business with the stone, and there was a battle in spite of all your efforts to buy peace and quiet, but I suppose you can hardly be blamed for that. All that had happened after he was stunned, Bilbo learned later, but it gave him more sorrow than joy, and he was now weary of his new adventure. He was aching in his bones for the homeward journey. That, however, was a little delayed, so in the meantime I'll tell you something of events. The eagles had long had suspicion of the goblins mustering. From their watchfulness, and the movements in the mountains could not be altogether hid. So they too had gathered in great numbers under the great eagle of the misty mountains, and at length, smelling battle from afar, they had come speeding down the gale in the nick of time. They it was who dislodged the goblins from their mountain slopes, casting them over precipices, or driving them down, shrieking and bewildered among their foes. It was not long before they had freed the lonely mountain, and elves and men on either side of the valley could come at last to the help of the battle below. But even with the eagles they were still outnumbered. In that last hour Beorn himself had appeared, no one knew how or from where. He came alone and in bear shape, and he seemed to have grown almost to giant size in his wrath. The roar of his voice was like drums and guns, and he had tossed wolves and goblins from his path like straws and feathers. He fell upon their rear and broke like a clap of thunder through the ring. The dwarves were making a stand still about their lords around a low rounded hill. Then Beorn stooped and lifted Thorin, who had fallen, pierced with spears, and bore him out of the fray. Okay, two things to mention here. One is that he mentions guns. And this is not the first edition. This is the revised edition that came out in the 60s that was after The Lord of the Rings. This is very much in Middle-earth. There are guns. I've mentioned this a few times in Quora, that goblins had cannons. People say, well, where is that said? Well, here, right here. The other thing is there's a... Beorn specifically going in to retrieve Thorin's body. Thorin's not actually dead at this point, of course, is somewhat reminiscent of Thorondor coming to claim the body of Fingolfin, the High King, or one of the eagles. I don't think it was Thorondor, but it might have been Gwaihir that went down into the pit to rescue the body of Glorfindel, who had died along with the Balrog in the Fall of Gondolin. Swiftly he returned, and his wrath was redoubled, so that nothing could withstand him, and no weapons seemed to bite upon him. He scattered the bodyguard, and pulled down Bolg himself, and crushed him. Then dismay fell upon the goblins, and they fled in all directions. But weariness left their enemies with the coming of new hope, and they pursued them closely, and prevented most of them from escaping where they could. They drove many of them into the running river, and as such fled south or west. They hunted in the marshes about the forest river, and there the greater part of the last fugitives perished, while those that came hardly to the wood elves' realm were there slain, or drawn in to die deep in the trackless dark of Mirkwood. Songs have said that 3 parts of the goblin warriors of the north perished on that day, and the mountains had peace for many a year. Victory had been assured before the fall of night, but the pursuit was still on foot when Bilbo returned to the camp, and not many were in the valley save the more grievously wounded. "Where are the eagles?" he asked Gandalf that evening, as he lay wrapped in many warm blankets. "Some are on the hunt," said the wizard, "but most have gone back to their eyries. They would not stay here, and departed with the first light of the morning. Dane has crowned their chief with gold, and sworn friendship with them forever." "I'm sorry. I should have liked to see them again," said Bilbo sleepily. "Perhaps I shall see them on the way home. I suppose I shall be going home soon." "As soon as you like," said the wizard. Actually, it was some days before Bilbo really set out. They buried Thorin deep beneath the mountain, and Bard laid the Arkenstone upon his breast. "There let it lie till the mountain falls," he said. "May it bring good fortune to all his folk that dwell hereafter." Upon his tomb the Elven king then laid Orcrist, the elvish sword that had been taken from Thorin in captivity. It is said in songs that it gleamed ever in the dark if foes approached, and the fortress of the dwarves could not be taken by surprise. There now Dane, son of Nain, took up his abode, and he became king under the mountain, and in time many other dwarves gathered to his throne in the ancient halls. Of the 12 companions of Thorin, 10 remained. Fili and Kili had fallen defending him with shield and body, for he was their mother's elder brother. The others remained with Dane, for Dane dealt his treasure well. There was, of course, no longer any question of dividing the hoard in such shares as had been planned, to Balin and Dwalin and Dori and Nori and Ori and Oin and Gloin and Bifur and Bofur and Bombor, or to Bilbo. Yet a 14th share of all the silver and gold, wrought and unwrought, was given up to Bard, for Dane said, "We will honor the agreement of the dead," as he now has the Arkenstone in his keeping. Even a 14th share was wealth exceedingly great, greater than that of many mortal kings. From that treasure awarded his followers and friends freely. To the Elven King he gave the emeralds of Girion, such jewels as he most loved, which Dane had restored to him. To Bilbo he said, "This treasure is as much yours as it is mine, though old agreements cannot stand, since so many have a claim in its winning its defense. Yet even though you are willing to lay aside all your claim, I should wish that the words of Thorin, of which he repented, should not prove true, that we should give you little. I would reward you most richly of all." "Very kind of you," said Bilbo, "but really, it is a relief to me. How on earth should I have gotten all that treasure home without war and murder all along the way? I don't know. And I don't know what I should have done with it when I got home. I'm sure it is better in your hands." In the end he would only take 2 small chests, one filled with silver and the other with gold, such as one strong pony could carry. "That'll be quite as much as I can manage," said he. And at last the time came for him to say goodbye to his friends. "Farewell, Balin," he said, "and farewell, Dwalin, and farewell, Dori, Nori, Ori, Oin, Gloin, Bifur, Bofur, and Bombur. May your beards never grow thin." And turning toward the mountain, he said, "Farewell, Thorin Oakenshield, and Fili and Kili. May your memory never fade." Then the dwarves bowed low before their gate, but the words stuck in their throats. "Goodbye and good luck wherever you fare," said Balin at last. "If ever you visit us again, when our halls are made fair once more, then the feast shall indeed be splendid." "If ever you're passing my way," said Bilbo, "don't wait to knock. Tea is at 4, but any of you are welcome at any time." Then he turned away. The elf host was on the march, and if it was sadly lessened, yet many were glad, for now the northern world would be merrier for many a long day. The dragon was dead, and the goblins overthrown. Okay, hold on a second here. Okay, never mind that. I just needed to check something. Sorry about that. The dragon was dead, and the goblins overthrown, and their hearts looked forward after winter to a spring of joy. Gandalf and Bilbo rode behind the Elven King, and beside them strode Beorn, once again in man shape, and he laughed and sang in a loud voice upon the road. So they went on until they drew near to the borders of Mirkwood, to the north of the place where the forest river ran out. Then they halted, for the wizard and Bilbo would not enter the wood, even though the king bade them stay a while in his halls. They intended to go along the edge of the forest and round its northern end to the waste that lay between it and the beginnings of the Grey Mountains. It was a long and cheerless road, but now that the goblins were crushed, it seemed safer to them than the dreadful pathways under the trees. Moreover, Beorn was going that way too. "Farewell, O Elven King," said Gandalf. "Merry be the greenwood, while the world is yet young, and merry be all your folk." "Farewell, O Gandalf," said the king. "May you ever appear where you are most needed and least expected. The oftener you appear in my halls, the better shall I be pleased." "I beg of you," said Bilbo, stammering and standing on one foot, "to accept this gift." And he brought out a necklace of silver and pearls that Dane had given him at their parting. "In what way have I earned such a gift, O Hobbit?" said the king. "Well, I thought, don't you know," said Bilbo, rather confused, "that some little return should be made for your hospitality. I mean, even a burglar has his feelings. I have drunk much of your wine and eaten much of your bread." "I will take your gift, O Bilbo the Magnificent," said the king gravely. "And I name you elf-friend and blessed. May your shadow never grow less, or stealing would be too easy. Farewell." Then the elves turned toward the forest, and Bilbo started on his long road home. He had many hardships and adventures before he got back. The wild was still the wild, and there were many other things in it in those days besides goblins. But he was well guided and well guarded. The wizard was with him and Beorn for much of the way, and he was never in great danger again. Anyway, by midwinter, Gandalf and Bilbo had come all the way back, along both edges of the forest to the doors of Beorn's house, and there for a while they both stayed. Yuletide was warm and merry there, and men came from far and wide to feast at Beorn's bidding. So I just want to pause there and say this is the first really mention of the Beornings, the followers that Beorn is said to have in the Third Age. That by the time of the Lord of the Rings, Beorn's passed on, and his son, Grim Beorn the Old, is basically the leader of a clan called the Bjorning. So men coming here and feasting with Bjorn is sort of the first hint towards that. The goblins of the Misty Mountains were now few and terrified and hidden in the deepest holes they could find, and the wargs had vanished from the woods, so that men went abroad without fear. Bjorn indeed became a great chief afterward in these regions, and ruled a wide land between the mountains and the wood, and it is said that for many generations the men of his line had the power of taking bear's shape. And some were grim men and bad, but most were in heart like Bjorn, if less in size and strength. In their day, the last goblins were hunted from the Misty Mountains, and a new peace came over the edge of the wild. It was spring, and a fair one with mild weathers and a bright sun, before Bilbo and Gandalf took their leave at the last of Bjorn. And though he longed for home, Bilbo left with regret, for the flowers of the gardens of Bjorn were in springtime no less marvelous than in high summer. At last they came up the long road, and reached the very pass where the goblins had captured them before. But they came to that high point at morning, and looking backward they saw a white sun shining over the outstretched lands. There behind lay Mirkwood, blue in the distance, and darkly green at the nearer edge even in the spring. There far away was the lonely mountain on the edge of eyesight. On its highest peak snow yet unmelted was gleaming pale. So comes snow after fire, and even dragons have their endings, said Bilbo, and he turned his back on his adventure. The Tookish part was getting very tired, and the Baggins was daily getting stronger. I wish now only to be in my own armchair, he said. Okay, we have one last chapter. It's rather short, just a few pages, but I absolutely have to take a bit of a break here to drink some water. It is getting late. I don't normally go this late. I would normally be done by now. But I resolved to finish this today. And finish it I shall. There's not a lot to say here that I didn't interject with already, so we're just going to go ahead and power through it here. With Chapter 19, The Last Stage. It was on May the 1st that the two came back at last to the brink in the valley of Rivendell, where stood the last or the first homely house. Again it was evening. Their ponies were tired, especially the one that carried the baggage, and they all felt in need of rest. As they rode down the steep path, Bilbo heard the elves still singing in the trees, as if they had not stopped since he left, and as soon as the riders came down into the lower glades of the wood, they burst into a song of much the same kind as before. This is something like it. The dragon is withered, his bones are now crumbled, his armor is shivered, his splendor is humbled. Though sword shall be rusted, and throne and crown perish, with strength that men trusted, and wealth that they cherish, here grass is still growing, and leaves are yet swinging, the white water flowing, elves are yet singing, come Tralla-lily, come back to the valley. The stars are far brighter than gems without measure, the moon is far wider than silver and treasure. The fire is more shining, a hearth in the morning, than gold won by mining, so why go a-roaming, O Tralla-lally, come back to the valley. Oh, where are you going so late in returning? The river is flowing, the stars are all burning. Oh, whither so laden, oh, so sad and so dreary? Here elf and elf maiden now welcome the weary, with Tralla-lally, come back to the valley. Tralla-lally, fa-la-la-lally, fa-la. 4:30 a.m. there. Wow, where are you exactly? That it's 4:30 a.m. We're nearly at the end here. Then the elves of the valley came out and greeted them, and led them across the water to the house of Elrond. There a warm welcome was made of them, and there were many eager ears that evening to hear the tale of their adventures. I pause here and wonder if one of the eager ears might have been a 9-year-old boy named Estelle, who would later turn out to be Aragorn. I've always had this sort of head canon that Bilbo might have met Aragorn as a very young boy, either coming to or going from the Lonely Mountain. Oh, you're in Germany, okay. You mentioned you were German, but I didn't know if you were actually living in Germany. Oh. Where was I? Oh, here we go. Most of the tale he knew... Oh, okay. It was... try that again. Gandalf it was who spoke, for Bilbo was fallen quiet and drowsy. Most of the tale he knew, for he had been in it, and he himself told much of it to the wizard on their homeward way, or in the house of Bjorn. But every now and again he would open an eye and listen, when a part of the story which he did not know came in. It was in this way that he learned where Gandalf had been to, for he overheard the words of the wizard to Elrond. It appears that Gandalf had been to a great council of the White Wizards, masters of lore and good magic, and they had at last driven the necromancer from the dark hold in the south of Mirkwood. "Ere long now," Gandalf was saying, "the forest will grow somewhat more wholesome. The north will be freed from that horror for many long years, I hope. Yet I wish he were banished from the world." "It would be well indeed," said Elrond. "But I fear that I will not come about in this age of the world, or for many after." We know he's wrong about that. When the tale of their journeyings was told, there was other tales, and yet more tales, tales of long ago, and tales of new things, and tales of no time at all, till Bilbo's head fell forward on his chest, and he snored comfortably in a corner. He woke to find himself in a white bed, and the moon shining through an open window. Below it many elves were singing loud and clear in the banks of the stream. "Sing, all ye joyful, now sing all together, the winds in the treetop, the winds in the heather. The stars are in blossom, the moon is in flower, and bright are the windows of night in her tower. Dance, all ye joyful, now dance all together. Soft is the grass, and let foot be like feather. The river is silver, the shadows are fleeing. Merry is May time, and merry our meeting. Sing we now softly, and dreams let us weave him. Wind him in slumber, and let us leave him. The wanderer sleepeth, now soft be his pillow. Lullaby, lullaby, alder and willow. Sigh no more pine till the wind of the morn. Fall moon, dark be the land. Hush, hush, oak, ash, and thorn. Hush, be all water till dawn is at hand." "Well, merry people," said Bilbo, looking out, "what time by the moon is this? Your lullaby would waken a drunken goblin, yet I thank you. And your snores would waken a stone dragon, yet we thank you," they answered with laughter. "It is drawing toward dawn, and you have slept now since the night's beginning. Tomorrow perhaps you'll be cured of weariness." "A little sleep does a great cure in the house of Elrond," said he. "But I will take all the cure I can get. A second good night, fair friends." And with that he went back to bed and slept till late morning. Weariness fell from him soon in that house, and he had many a merry jest and dance, early and late, with the elves of the valley. Yet even that place could not long delay him now, and he thought always of his own home. After a week, therefore, he said farewell to Elrond, and giving him such small gifts that he would accept, he rode away with Gandalf. Even as they left the valley, the sky darkened in the west before them, and the wind and rain came up to meet them. "Merry is May time," said Bilbo, as the rain beat into his face. "But our back is to legends, and we are coming home. I suppose this is the first taste of it." "There is a long road yet," said Gandalf. "But it's the last road," said Bilbo. They came to the river that marked the very edge of the borderland of the wild, and to the ford beneath the steep bank, as you may remember. The water was swollen both with the melting of the snows at the approach of summer and the day-long rain, but they crossed with some difficulty and pressed forward, as evening fell on the last stage of their journey. This was much as it had been before, except that the company was smaller and more silent. Also, this time there were no trolls. At each point on the road, Bilbo recalled the happenings in the words of a year ago. It seemed to him more like 10, so that of course he quickly noted that this place where the pony had fallen in the river, and they had turned aside from their nasty adventure with Tom and Bert and Bill. Not far from the road they found the gold of the trolls, which they had buried, still hidden and untouched. "I have enough to last me my time," said Bilbo when they had dug it up. "You had better take this, Gandalf. I dare say you can find a use for it." "Indeed I can," said the wizard. "But share and share alike. You may find that you have more needs than you expect." So they put the gold in bags and slung them on the ponies, who were not at all pleased about it. After that their going was slower, for most of the time they walked, but the land was green, and there was much grass throughout, which the hobbit strolled along contentedly. He mopped his face with a red silk handkerchief. No, not a single one of his own had survived. He had borrowed this one from Elrond, for now June had brought summer, and the weather was bright and hot again. As all things came to an end, even this story, a day came at last when they were in sight of the country where Bilbo had been born and bred, where the shapes of his land and the trees were as well known to him as his hands and toes. Coming to a rise, he could see his own hill in the distance, and he stopped suddenly and said, "Roads go ever on and on, over rock and under tree, by caves where never sun has shone, by streams that never find the sea, over snow by winter sown, and through merry flowers of June, over grass and over stone, and under mountains in the moon. Roads go ever on, under cloud and under star, yet feet that wandering have gone turn at last to home afar. Eyes that fire and sword have seen, and horror in the halls of stone, look at last on meadows green, and trees and hills they long have known." Gandalf looked at him. "My dear Bilbo," he said, Something is the matter with you. You're not the hobbit that you were. And so they crossed the bridge and passed the mill by the river that came right back to Bilbo's own door. "Bless me, what's going on?" he cried. There was a great commotion, and people of all sorts, respectable and unrespectable, were thick round the door, and many were going in and out, not even wiping their feet on the mat, as Bilbo noticed with annoyance. If he was surprised, they were more surprised still. He had arrived back in the middle of an auction. There was a large notice in black and red hung on the gate, stating that on June the 22nd, Messrs. Grubb, and Burrows would sell by auction the effects of the late Bilbo Baggins, Esquire, of Bag End, Underhill, Hobbiton. Sale to commence at 10 o'clock sharp. It was now nearly lunchtime, and most of the things had already been sold, for various prices, from next to nothing to old songs, as is not unusual at auctions. Bilbo's cousins, the Sackville Bagginses, were in fact busy measuring his rooms to see if their own furniture would fit. In short, Bilbo was presumed dead, and not everybody that said so was sorry to find the presumption wrong. The return of Mr. Bilbo Baggins created quite a disturbance both under the hill and over the hill and across the water. It was a great deal more than a 9 days' wonder. The legal bother, indeed, lasted for years. It was quite a long time before Mr. Baggins was in fact admitted to be alive again. Quite realistic, by the way. This has happened many times where somebody is legally declared dead and they're not. And it takes a long time of unraveling before the governing body, whatever it may be, will declare them to be alive. And I think Tolkien might have had some sort of experience with this, perhaps coming home from the war, perhaps some of his friends had survived but been declared dead for some reason. And because this is just too realistic right here. The people who had got especially good bargains at the sale took a deal of convincing, and in the end, to save time, Bilbo had to buy back quite a lot of his own furniture. Many of his silver spoons mysteriously disappeared and were never accounted for. Personally, he suspected the Sackville Bagginses. On their side, they never admitted that the returned Baggins was genuine, and they were not on friendly terms with Bilbo ever after. They really had wanted to live in his nice hobbit hole so very much. Indeed, Bilbo found that he had lost more than spoons. He had lost his reputation. It is true that forever after he remained an elf friend, and had the honor of the dwarves, wizards, and all such folk as ever passed this way. But he was no longer quite respectable. He was in fact held by all people, held by all the hobbits of the neighborhood to be queer, except by his nephews and nieces on the Took side, but even they were not encouraged in their friendship by their elders. I'm sorry to say that he did not mind. He was quite content, and the sound of the kettle on his hearth was ever more after musical than it had been even in the quiet days before the unexpected party. His sword he hung over the mantelpiece. His coat of mail he arranged on stand in the hall, until he lent it to a museum. I mentioned the museum earlier, the museum at Meikle Delving, and why it had to be that he did not give the mail to Frodo. His gold and silver was largely spent in presents, both useful and extravagant, which to a certain extent accounts for the affection of his nephews and his nieces. His magic ring he kept a great secret, for he chiefly used it when unpleasant callers came. He took to writing poetry and visiting the elves, and though many shook their heads and touched their foreheads and said, "Poor old Baggins," and though very few believed any of his tales, he remained very happy to the end of his days, and those were extraordinarily long. One autumn evening some years after, Bilbo was sitting in his study writing his memoirs. He thought of calling them There and Back Again, A Hobbit's Holiday, when there was a ring at the door. It was Gandalf and a dwarf, and the dwarf was actually Balin. Come in," said Bilbo, and soon they were settled in chairs by the fire. If Balin noticed that Mr. Baggins's waistcoat was more extensive, he had real gold buttons, Bilbo also noticed that Balin's beard was several inches longer, and his jeweled belt was of great magnificence. They fell to talking of their times together, of course, and Bilbo asked how things were going in the lands of the mountain. It seems they were going very well. Bard had rebuilt the town and dale, and men had gathered to him from the lake and from the south and west, and all the valley had become tilled again and rich. And the desolation was now filled with birds and blossoms in spring, and fruit and feasting in autumn. And Lake Town was refounded and was more prosperous than ever, and much wealth went up and down the running river, and there was friendship in those parts between the elves and dwarves and men. The old master had come to a bad end. Bard had given him much gold for the help of the lake people, but being of the kind that easily catches such disease, he fell under the dragon sickness, and took most of his wealth, and fled with it, and died of starvation in the waste, deserted by his companions. The new master is of wiser kind, said Balin, and very popular, for of course he gets most of the credit for the present prosperity. They are making songs which say that, in his day, the rivers run with gold. Then the prophecies of the old songs have turned out to be true after a fashion, said Bilbo. Of course, said Gandalf. And why should they not prove true? Surely you don't disbelieve prophecies because you had a hand in bringing them about yourself. You don't really suppose, do you, that all your adventures and escapes were managed by mere luck, just for your sole benefit? You're a very fine person, Mr. Baggins, and I'm very fond of you, but you are only quite a little fellow in a wide world after all. Thank goodness, said Bilbo, laughing, and handed him the tobacco jar. All right, and that's actually the end of The Hobbit. The thing to mention there is tobacco jar. That kind of, they mentioned it a few times in the early chapters of The Hobbit, and here you see it's like basically the last line of the book is Bilbo handing Gandalf the tobacco jar. And of course, tobacco is what they smoke. Starting in The Lord of the Rings, they start calling it pipeweed or Westman's weed. So, of course, because of the weed part, a lot of the more fanciful readings, especially in the 60s and 70s, placed it as being a form of cannabis. But Tolkien was very clear that it was nicotiana, and he was actually taken to task. Yes, of course, the dragon sickness can affect anybody. Even Bilbo got a little touch of it earlier on. And like I said, it's the sickness that comes from the power of Melkor in the gold, in the earth, which I said, it's either Morgoth's ring or the Peoples of Middle-earth that spoke specifically about the power of gold. But going back to the nicotiana thing, Tolkien was actually taken to task for a lot of the what people called anachronisms in his work, even though they're it's fantasy and we need not worry about that. His conceit of it being the distant past leads us to issues with this portion of Middle-earth basically being Europe, and plants and things that are not native to Europe being there during this time, such as tobacco, tomatoes, potatoes. He wound up revising out in revision of The Hobbit and revision of The Lord of the Rings any mention of tomatoes, which come from South America. Potatoes also come from South America, but he kept those in because he felt that they were too important to the custom and the culture of rural English, which is what the Hobbits essentially are. Tobacco was explained to have come from Numenor. So that's easy enough, right? Numenor is essentially Atlantis. As a matter of fact, one of the names for it may be called Numenor, Westernesse, Avalone, but also Atalanta, which is very close to the name of Atlantis. And one of the stories that he had wanted to write about Numenor, which was called The Lost Road, which was actually supposed to be a science fiction story involving time travel. And only a little bit of it got written before he gave it up. It was a project that he was doing alongside C.S. Lewis, although C.S. Lewis finished his end. Tolkien never finished his end, because that's just Tolkien for you. But The Lost Road, was like the biggest Numenor story. It's included in The Fall of Numenor, if you get that book. But he wanted to make basically a modern retelling of the Atlantis myth. But anyway, we have gone quite late. It is after 11. I usually end at 10:20, but I really wanted to finish The Hobbit today. I'm actually going to stop the recording here, and we're going to go over the schedule, and we're going to rate out. So for everybody watching on YouTube, thank you, and we'll see you guys soon. We're going to end it here.